With Spider-Man Brand New Day releasing in theaters, we have now had 9 live-action Spider-Man movies over the past 24 years. The 3 Tobey Maguire films, the 2 Andrew Garfield films, and now the 4 Tom Holland films. We've had different directors, different actors, and different interpretations of the characters. In this video, what I want to do is go through the entire history of these 9 live-action Spider-Man movies. I want to dive deep into the productions of each of these movies, looking at some of the secrets that went into these movies being made. I want to look at the legacies of these films and how they have aged, but most importantly, I want to dive deep into the stories and see how they hold up many years later. I will end this video with my review of Brand New Day, so if you want to skip to that portion of the video, then you can click on the timestamp right here. Hello everybody and welcome to another video. My name is The Goldman and today we're gonna cover the complete history of the Spider-Man movies. Now, as you guys know, throughout all the various iterations of Spider-Man, he has had a ton of accessories. If you wanna up your accessory game in a way that matches your style, then you should consider checking out Casetify, who are also the kind sponsors of today's video. Casetify makes accessories that elevate your everyday. From phone cases to suitcases to bag charms, Casetify is all about adding a little bit more of you to everything you carry. I want to highlight some of their phone cases because I'm in love with them. Now, when it comes to phone cases, everyone is most concerned about how it protects their phone. With Casetify, that is the least of your worries, because Casetify is built to handle everyday moments to unexpected chaos. If you're a normal, clumsy person like me, then the impact case is going to protect you from pretty much every day-to-day scenario. If you're a bit more active and you use your phone more often, the bounce case will provide the most protection. These cases have 21.3 feet of drop protection. With these cases, your phone is going to feel normal while lasting a really long time. If you don't think you're one to drop your phone much, then you can get the mirror case to add a bit more style. And the mirror cases are still protected with 6.6 feet of drop protection. Casetify phone cases also come with accessories, like the grip stand or even the card holder. Now, in my opinion, the coolest part about these phone cases are the vast amounts of options you have. If you're a big nerd like me, you can get one of the collab cases. They have Star Wars ones for you Star Wars nerds out there, and since this is a Spider-Man video, I cannot forget to highlight their Spider-Man cases. Casetify also has some in-house prints you can choose from, or cases made from a handful of artists. Either way, there are so many ways you can make your phone case represent you. If you want a phone case that you can trust, that is reliable, that will last a long time, and that represents you, then you can check out my link in the description to get your Casetify case today. Again, that's with my link in the description, and you can get your first case today. That's with fast shipping and a 6-month warranty. Thank you so much to Casetify for sponsoring this video. Spider-Man has always been one of the most popular comic book characters, created by Stan Lee and making his first appearance all the way back in 1962. However, the earliest attempts at making a live-action Spider-Man movie were all the way back in the 80s. After the success of 1978's Superman, there was interest in developing another superhero movie to rival it. However, after the release of Superman 3 in 1983, which was a critical and commercial failure, comic book movies became harder to sell to studios. So the Spider-Man project was put on hold. Eventually, the Cannon Group acquired the rights to Spider-Man in 1985 for just $225,000, and they began development on a Spider-Man movie. Leslie Stevens was brought on to write the screenplay, and Joseph Zito was brought on to direct the film. Allegedly, there was interest in casting Tom Cruise to play Peter Parker. However, after the commercial and critical bombs of Superman 4 and Masters of the Universe, both releasing in 1987 and both made by the Cannon Group, the Spider-Man movie was yet again put on hold. In the 1990s, there was another attempt by James Cameron, of all people, to direct a Spider-Man movie. Cameron even revealed that he considered Leonardo DiCaprio for the role of Peter Parker. However, after the disaster that was Batman and Robin, the movie yet again was put on hold. The 80s and 90s, while having a few successful comic book movies like Batman, weren't ready to try out Spider-Man. However, in 1998, after the release of Blade and with X-Men under production, another attempt on Spider-Man was made. Marvel sold the rights to Sony for $7 million, and a screenplay was issued based on some of the ideas made by James Cameron. Michael Bay, Tim Burton, Chris Columbus, Roland Emmerich, David Fincher, Ang Lee, and even M. Night Shyamalan were all considered for the director's chair. Fincher was offered the job, but he ended up turning it down. Chris Columbus was also offered the job, but turned it down to direct Harry Potter instead. Eventually, Sam Raimi was hired to direct, with production beginning in January of 2001. Tobey Maguire was actually Sam Raimi's first choice for the role of Peter Parker after he saw him in The Cider House Rules. The studio didn't love the idea, but were won over after his audition. Rounding out the cast was Willem Dafoe as Norman Osborn, James Franco as Harry Osborn, and Kirsten Dunst as Mary Jane Watson. Funny enough, Stan Lee himself was interested in playing J. Jonah Jameson, but the role went to J.K. Simmons, who has since been praised for one of the best comic book castings in history. Principal photography began in January of 2001 and concluded in June of 2001. One of the most notable behind-the-scenes lore of this movie was how the 9/11 terrorist attacks impacted the production of the film. There were posters featuring the Twin Towers, as well as a teaser trailer which featured the Twin Towers. Both ended up being removed and replaced. The Twin Towers actually made it into 2 shots of the final movie. Roughly a year later, on May 3rd, 2002, Spider-Man was released in theaters. Now, before I dive deep into the story and how it's all constructed, which is usually the bread and butter of my videos, I want to spend some time talking about the life this movie has. I typically cringe when people say that modern movies don't have any character or style to them, because I feel like a lot of movies still do. I would say the newest Superman movie is a great example of a movie that does have character and life to it. What I will say though is that I can't recall a series of movies that have as much life and as much character as the Sam Raimi Spider-Man movies. These movies exude creativity around every corner, just from the way these movies are filmed, to the little transitions between scenes, to the music, to the montage sequences. This movie has things that I almost rarely see in blockbuster movies these days. Most fans talk about the swinging scenes and how shit like that is lacking these days. I totally agree. They give these movies so much energy, it's hard to explain. I really do feel like this style takes these movies to the next level. These movies aren't meant to be the most serious movies in the world. They're campy, and sometimes you have to suspend your disbelief in order to make things work for yourself. But these movies really go out of their way to make sure you buy into that campiness. The sequence of Peter sketching out his suit for the first time is one of my favorite examples of this. When was the last time a comic book movie was filmed with this much creativity? It just doesn't happen anymore. These parts of this movie and the entire trilogy I love so much. Now, another criminally underrated aspect of these movies is what it does with its setting. New York is a character in these movies. One thing that really caught my eye is just how much time is spent on the streets of New York and how these scenes were likely filmed on the streets of New York. They're often establishing shots, but they do so much to give this movie life. Even Peter and MJ's neighborhood. This is clearly a real place where real people live. I couldn't tell you what the house of any of the other Spider-Men look like, but I can with this Spider-Man. The first Avengers movie mostly takes place in New York, but it never feels as close to being New York as these movies do. Everything feels like a set there, while these Spider-Man movies feel like New York. Also, even the interiors of these movies really stand out. I love the contrast of how welcoming and warm the Parker house is compared to the coldness of the Osborn mansion. Again, it's all about giving life to these movies. I don't know if it's simply because these movies are older or because Sam Raimi made that extra effort. Either way, New York really stands out. Now, if I had to be critical of some elements of this movie, yeah, not all of it has aged the best. Some of the CGI is a little bit dated, and some of the campiness just isn't for me. Like the skeleton bomb during the parade is comical to me. Also, a lot of the dialogue isn't the best, most specifically from Harry, but I can look past a lot of these flaws because overall this first movie is excellent. Now, what makes it truly excellent is the story, so let's dive deep into that. This first movie really feels like it's divided into two halves. The first half of the movie is pretty much solely character development for our main character, most notably Peter. The second half, starting with the parade, is when Spider-Man and Green Goblin begin to clash and the main plot kicks in. Now, one thing this movie deserves a lot of credit for is how excellently designed it is. Yes, this is not the most serious movie in the world, and yes, it's not the most complex movie in the world, but that doesn't mean the movie isn't brilliant. That doesn't mean the screenplay doesn't perfectly fit this story. Its simplicity is not a weakness, it's a strength. Spider-Man is so much about Peter Parker and his struggles, and a good Spider-Man movie really needs to focus on that. The first half of this movie has close to no plot. Only scenes with Norman really progress the plot. I'm fine with that because the writer spends so much time developing Peter and his journey. By the time Peter gets bit, like 10 minutes into the movie, we already know so much about him. This is an origin story after all, so yeah, it should focus more so on character than plot. These movies are Peter Parker films, they're not Spider-Man films. So what is Peter's arc in this movie really about? I would argue it's a movie about discovering identity. After the opening credits, something I find to be really dated by the way, the first lines we hear Peter asking are, "Who am I?" Peter doesn't know yet. He's a kid, he doesn't know who he wants to be yet. To make matters worse, Peter has it pretty rough. No one respects him, he gets bullied, and the girl he loves doesn't even know who he is. Young men and women, especially those in high school, have no clue who they are, so they define themselves by how others see them. Everyone sees Peter as a loser, so he sees himself as a loser. MJ makes him feel invisible, so he feels invisible. Not once does he stand up for himself before he gets his powers. He needs Harry to stand up for him. It even takes the entire scene for Peter to muster the courage to even talk to MJ. Eventually, Peter gets bit by the spider and wakes up the next day with his new powers. After gaining his powers, he loves the attention he gets from it. What nerdy boy wouldn't? Who wouldn't want to beat up the bully? Again, someone with no identity thrives off the opinion of others. By the way, I love how this movie balances showing off Peter's new powers, how he feels about them, and how it highlights his biggest flaws. The entire opening of the movie specifically, I found to be excellently written. Each scene where Peter discovers a new power says more about him than it does anything else, and that's good writing. Now, because Peter has all these new powers and he feels great about himself, he lets it get to his head. He's still young, he's cocky, arrogant, and impatient. This leads to his conversation with Ben, where he's disrespectful. He doesn't listen to Ben's words because all he cares about is impressing MJ in the most superficial way possible. I love how this movie treats Peter discovering his new powers as a metaphor for aging into adulthood. Peter needs to figure out what kind of man he's going to be with these new powers. When any young man or woman graduates high school, they need to figure out what kind of person they're going to be. And for a kids movie, which Spider-Man is, I think it's an excellent message. Now, at this point in the story, Peter doesn't know what kind of person he's going to be. That's why he's trying to get a new car, and that's why he lets the robber go, because he cares more about how these things make him feel rather than what they actually say about him. Of course, this leads to Uncle Ben's death, which is the turning point for the character. Peter suffered the consequences of his actions. He wasn't responsible with his new powers, and look what happened because of it. Yes, he gets his revenge, but that doesn't fulfill him. It's only a short-term fix for his long-term problem. He still has no identity. Who is Peter Parker? Everything up to this point in the movie is all character. Again, there is very little plot, but it works because it set Peter down this well thought out and well executed arc. People may complain that this version of Spider-Man isn't as quippy as other versions. I don't care as much because this trilogy, more so than the other movies, has so much heart, especially his scenes with MJ, so let's talk about that. MJ is clearly a dated character. She's a damsel in distress like 3 times in each movie, and all she does is scream. Now, while I don't think she's the most interesting love interest in a comic book movie, I gotta give the writers credit. I do think she's a well thought out and well layered character. MJ is a real person with passions, dreams, and characteristics. She's dated, but she's a real person. MJ struggles with her identity too. At first, she's just the popular girl who hangs out with the popular guys because that's what girls her age do. One of the more touching scenes of the movie is the first time Peter and MJ really talk to each other. Peter overhears MJ's abusive father and then tries to console her in the backyard. episode. MJ feels lost. She has no identity. She doesn't even know what really makes her happy. What she eventually learns about herself in this movie is that she needs someone that sees her, the real her. Her family doesn't see her, Flash Thompson doesn't see her, Harry doesn't see her, but Peter does. MJ probably wants to be an actress because that's how she feels she can be seen. It's funny, at the end of the scene, Peter's takeaway is that he needs to get a nice car to impress MJ, but in reality, by listening to her and encouraging her dreams, that's how he's going to win her over. When she reveals to Peter that she has a job as a waitress, he doesn't shame her. He encourages her to have a job, to pursue her dreams. Peter helps MJ go on an arc where she figures out her identity, what she really wants. So despite her character being a little bit dated, I gotta applaud the writers for tying her story into the main theme of the movie. The same could be said for Harry. Harry's entire story revolves around daddy issues. Harry has been raised by his father to earn his love and affection, by doing well in school or by living up to his potential, quote unquote. In his first scene, Harry is shamed for not living up to his dad's expectations. When he graduates high school, he gets the bare minimum amount of approval. The only time Harry gets his father's approval in a meaningful way is when Harry admits he was wrong and that his father was right. You know how emotionally manipulative that is? Now, unlike MJ and Peter, Harry isn't really struggling with his identity because his entire identity revolves around his father's approval. Now, don't get me wrong, this is an incredibly unhealthy way to live, but that's the life he's living right now. When Norman dies in the end, Harry's daddy issues are so deep it leads into the next two movies. Harry's story ties into the themes of this movie in a different way. It shows how unhealthy centering your identity around another person's approval is, and we see where it leads Harry by the end of the story. Now, I would argue the second most important character of the movie is Norman, so let's talk about him. The Green Goblin is an over-the-top villain for sure. Let's be real, no military-grade suit of armor would ever look like this. But the reason Norman's story still works is because of how tragic he is deep down. External success and approval are the only things that matter to Norman right now. He wants to feel right and superior to everyone else. His identity is so dependent on how others view him. Norman shames his son because his son isn't living up to these superficial expectations. Why should he love Harry if Harry isn't good in school? As I just mentioned, he's emotionally manipulative towards his son, gives him approval after Harry agrees with him. The Green Goblin persona is built up anger at the world trying to tear him down as he sees it. He's lashing out because of that. He doesn't feel rewarded for his hard work and sacrifice. If people don't love and admire you, then what is the point? Everyone should lift up exceptional people like Norman. Once he loses his company and all its funding, that's when he comes to the conclusion that, as he says, people will always turn on you despite all you have done for them. The Goblin wants to destroy everything that is out of Norman's control. He wants to believe that acting out of self-interest is what's best for everyone. Like Harry, so much of Norman's identity is how others see him. It doesn't matter that he's rich. It doesn't matter that he has a successful company. Others need to see him as exceptional. When he meets Spider-Man, he can't wrap his head around the fact that Spider-Man wants to help people because it's the right thing to do. He thinks Spider-Man only does it for approval. This is why Norman wants to challenge Spider-Man. He goes out of his way to convince him of his ways. Why help the people if they're going to turn on you eventually? But Peter rejects Goblin, which causes Goblin to go after Peter in the end. I don't really love this bit of Norman challenging Peter's beliefs, because Peter doesn't really struggle with this throughout the second half of the movie. He looks at a newspaper one time proving Norman's point, he questions it once, and that's it. The end of the movie is more so Peter affirming his new identity and belief. What he believes is right. So Norman gives Spider-Man an ultimatum: save MJ or save all these innocent people. Norman wants Spider-Man to save MJ and sacrifice all those kids so the public will turn on him. Peter is able to save both, which I really hate, by the way. I hate false stakes, but that's not too important to this movie. The New Yorkers stand up for Peter, proving Goblin wrong that you can be beloved if you do good things. Then everything climaxes in a truly beautiful ending. Peter gets beaten up, which I love, by the way. I love the physicality of these movies. Then Norman tries one last time to turn Peter to his side. Remember, Norman believes that everyone is motivated by external validation. So what does he do? He gives Peter his approval. "You are like a son to me, I'm so proud of you." He talks to Peter the same way he talks to Harry. In the beginning of the movie, this would have worked. This is the approval Peter would have wanted, but Peter has gone on an arc. He knows who he is now. He is Spider-Man. I have a father, his name was Ben Parker, is so important to his arc about identity, because what his father told him is who he wants to be, a good man who treats his great power responsibly. Peter doesn't need external validation anymore. When you're comfortable with your identity, other people don't matter as much. So Norman's manipulation doesn't work, and it gets him killed. Perfect way to cap off Peter's arc. But the movie doesn't end there. MJ wants to be with Peter, but Peter says no. To him, the responsible thing to do would be to protect MJ. So despite his own feelings, he lets MJ go, and the movie ends with Peter saying, "Who am I? I'm Spider-Man." A great way to end the movie. Spider-Man scored a 90% on Rotten Tomatoes, along with a suspiciously low 67% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 7.4 out of 10. Spider-Man would end up grossing $804 million at the box office, which not only made it a massive success for Sony, but that also made it the third highest grossing movie of the year, with Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter taking the top spots. Spider-Man also managed to outperform Star Wars pretty easily. The movie resonated with audiences so deeply all over the world, but most specifically New Yorkers. With the September 11th terrorist attack still fresh on New Yorkers' minds, the unity of the New Yorkers shown in that movie hit hard for a lot of people. Spider-Man also reinvigorated belief in the comic book genre, far more than Blade or X-Men ever did. It's fair to say that without this movie, the MCU and the entire comic book industry as we know it wouldn't exist. So it's not surprising that right after this movie came out, the sequel was greenlit. Sam Raimi instantly signed on to return, and production went underway. Now, to be honest, there's not much interesting that went on during the production of this movie. Right from the start, Raimi knew that Doc Ock would be the main villain of the movie. Early drafts of the sequel had Doc Ock being a much younger version of the character, one that would compete with Peter for MJ's love, but that idea was scrapped relatively quickly. Another interesting thing to note was that Tobey Maguire re-aggravated a pre-existing back condition filming Seabiscuit, and it was said that if he injured his back, he could be paralyzed. This led to Jake Gyllenhaal being cast to replace Tobey Maguire, but eventually Tobey recovered and reclaimed the role. This was actually the source of Tobey's "my back" joke featured in the movie. The rest of the production went pretty smoothly, with principal photography beginning in April of 2003 and reshoots concluding the following February. On June 30th, 2004, Spider-Man 2 would release in theaters. Now, Spider-Man 2, even more so than the previous movie, has the sauce. For one, this movie is shot in a more cinematic aspect ratio, switching from a 16:9 widescreen aspect ratio to a 21:9 ultra-wide aspect ratio. This just allows there to be more on the screen. And with a movie where someone swings through the streets of New York, that's typically a good thing. I'd also argue the visual effects are much better in this movie. 22 years later, and this movie still looks really good. It's a little bit dated, but you're only going to notice that if you're specifically looking for it. Another thing I'd argue is that the action is much better here. It seems like Sam Raimi had more freedom to do what he wanted with the action in this film, and I feel like for a Sam Raimi film, that's typically a good thing. Is there anything more iconic than the train sequence? That one transition into Doc Ock's glasses is one of the most iconic transition shots in a comic book movie. And then having that transition to the actual train fight where so much is done visually and technically was awesome. I love the detail at the end where Peter needs a second to figure out what to do. He doesn't just figure it out on the spot. I'll touch on it later when I dive deeper into the story, but this whole sequence is phenomenal. Now, an underrated part of this movie that I don't hear talked about enough is the humor. This movie is genuinely funny, and not in an MCU kind of way, which makes it feel a lot more fresh. Little things that stuck out to me were the 15 seconds that were spent showing Peter putting the brooms back in the closet. J. Jonah Jameson is also hilarious in this movie. At one point, Peter hands him a photo and he says, "It stinks, page 1, please." That was so funny to me. Also, I get that the point of this movie is to torture Peter around every turn, but some of the things that happen to him are straight comical. When he's at the banquet, he keeps getting robbed of the chance to have an hors d'oeuvre. I can't explain it, that was so funny to me. Or in the beginning of the movie when Peter drops his books and people keep walking into him. This movie is genuinely funny at times, but not in an overbearing way, which I really appreciate. Lastly, like the previous movie, New York continues to be such an important character. Raimi continues to make an effort to not only show the people of New York, but street level scenes where people are actually walking through the streets of New York. I love it, it adds so much to the movie. But what truly makes this movie great is this story, so let's talk about that. The first movie to me was all about identity and responsibility. The second movie feels like it is about choice, what it means to do the right thing, and how that isn't always so easy. Now, just like the first movie, what makes this movie so great to me is just how Peter focused it is. I don't need to repeat myself too much. The most important part of any Spider-Man movie to me is the characterization of Peter Parker. This movie nails that more than any other Spider-Man movie. This movie also follows a pretty similar formula to the previous movie. The first half of the movie is a balance between Peter's struggles and the villain becoming more villainous. Then towards the halfway point of the movie, they clash for the first or second time, and then they're at war with each other until the end of the movie. Let's begin by talking about Peter in the first half of this movie. This first hour feels solely devoted to beating Peter up emotionally as much as possible. This poor guy cannot catch a break. The movie begins with him getting fired from his pizza job because he was late saving a kid as Spider-Man. Then the movie transitions right away to him getting fired from the Daily Bugle. Now, he doesn't actually get fired from the Daily Bugle, but it shows how unkind that job is to him. Eventually, we find out that it is his birthday. So a pretty shitty birthday. And then we get a pretty sad scene where we learn Aunt May is losing the house because she doesn't have Ben there to help her pay the bills. This movie makes it clear that being Spider-Man is hurting every other aspect of Peter's life. Everything in his life right now is a contradiction. Now, one thing that's repeatedly thrown in Peter's face in this movie is MJ. MJ is now a somewhat successful actress, and her face is on posters and billboards all over the city. I love that this movie explores a superhero dealing with the consequences of their sacrifice. Peter at the end of the first movie decided not to be with MJ because it was the right thing to do. Just because he made that choice doesn't mean he's always content with it. It's going to be hard for him to deal with actually saying no. And we see that. Peter sees posters of MJ constantly, and it makes him feel terrible. Sacrifice is not supposed to be easy, and this movie shows that. I really hope Brand New Day does something similar with how it shows how hard Peter's sacrifice was at the end of No Way Home. The movie moves on and continues to show him struggling to balance his life. He misses MJ's play, which really upsets her, and he can't even make it to class. Peter can't even form meaningful relationships because as Spider-Man, he must keep that a secret. No superhero movie has ever done a better job at showing how being a superhero would impact someone, how hard it would be to find that balance. This movie makes it feel like being Spider-Man would suck, and that's a really hard thing to do. This internal conflict Peter faces, as we come to see, is the foundation of this movie. While he's struggling with this, Peter meets Doc Ock, and he appears to be everything Peter wants to be: successful, making a difference, having love. How can Peter have this? Why can't Peter have this? Well, not everyone is perfect. In the blink of an eye, Otto's experiment goes awry, and he loses everything. As this happens, Peter starts to lose his powers because of his internal turmoil. He decided to be Spider-Man at the end of the first movie, but now he's questioning it, and he's certainly not at peace. Roughly around the halfway point of the movie is when we get the banquet scene, and this is Peter's worst nightmare. Everything goes wrong for him. He can't get an hors d'oeuvre or drink, he can't get good pictures, he gets yelled at by his boss, Harry lashes out at him because he resents Peter, MJ rejects him again, and to cap it all off, she's revealed to be getting married, to his boss's son no less. This movie does a really good job at creating realistic problems for Peter. Now, the way these problems play out is a bit comical, but each individual problem is very real. Even problems that other people are having feel very real, like May losing her house and not being able to afford it. This isn't resolved by the end of the movie, by the way. It's not like Bruce Wayne shows up to buy the house from the bank. And you know what? That's okay. That's real life. So Peter is tired of the weight of being Spider-Man. He just wants to be Peter Parker again. Now, what makes this really hard for Peter is that Peter rejecting Spider-Man is also rejecting Ben. Peter convinces himself that this was Ben's wish for him, not his own. So he comes to the conclusion that his sacrifice in the first movie wasn't worth it, so he gives up Spider-Man. He initially feels pretty great. Everything is going right. His classes are better, his work is better, and he's just significantly less stressed. But then he gets a reality check that his problems aren't all fixed. MJ is still mad at him, his aunt got mad at him, Harry is still mad at him. He eventually realizes the consequences of not being Spider-Man. Crime is up, he doesn't stop someone from being mugged, he can't save everyone from a burning building. It all makes him feel terrible. It turns out giving up Spider-Man doesn't make him feel better. So what's the point? What's the point of Peter struggling so much balancing his life as Spider-Man only for him to continue struggling with it after he gives up Spider-Man? Well, this leads us into Peter telling Aunt May the truth about the night Ben died. Because this scene thematically is emblematic of the entire movie. Peter did the right thing by telling Aunt May the truth about what really happened that night. Initially, May rejects him and makes him feel really bad about it, but eventually when he goes back to May, May is apologetic and is really happy Peter told her the truth. She reinforces that what he did was right despite her initial reaction. She and Peter are closer because of it. May then gives her speech about being a hero and how it isn't easy, how sometimes doing the right thing or doing what's truly fulfilling is going to suck, but eventually it will make you better and all the people around you better. It keeps us honest, gives us strength, makes us noble. There is a hero in all of us. Yeah, being Spider-Man sucked for a bit, but you know, you just have to hold on a little bit longer, because Spider-Man wasn't just Ben's wish, it's who Peter really is. It makes him feel good, and he loves doing the right thing. So after Otto attacks Peter and captures MJ, Peter is ready again to be Spider-Man, because that is who he is, regardless of the consequences or the struggles. We then get the train fight, and it ends with Peter nearly dying to save these people. Fighting on the train and saving those people reminds Peter of why he is Spider-Man. Seeing those people on the train thank him and feeling inspired is why he does this. He just needed to hold on a little bit longer, like May said. There will be hard times, doing the right thing isn't always sexy, but at the end of the day, it will be worth it. When he sees the kid give him his mask back, that's the moment where he remembers all the pain is worth it, for them. It's not just the action that makes this whole train scene great. It ends in such a beautiful way. Any superhero fan watching this scene feels so inspired, and that's what Spider-Man is supposed to represent. The movie proceeds with Otto capturing Peter and delivering him to Harry. Harry finds out the truth and he is stunned. Now, I want to talk about Harry because it's not just Peter who's struggling with balance in this movie. Harry is as well. Harry begins the movie being more productive with his life, leading his father's business and making a difference. Now, how Oscorp is still in business after the events of the first movie is a mystery to me, but still Harry is working towards a positive goal. Then Otto's experiment goes wrong, and Oscorp allegedly goes out of business. Harry has this awful line of dialogue where he says, "I'm ruined, I have nothing left besides Spider-Man," but narratively it's important. He is at his lowest, and instead of being steady, he gives in to his worst impulses. In a way, Oscorp was Harry's Spider-Man. It made him fulfilled and it made him feel like he was doing the right thing. When that goes away, he focuses entirely on his destructive dream of killing Spider-Man. Chasing dreams feels good, but it's not always the right thing, and it's not always going to make you fulfilled. We'll see where this leads Harry in the future. Now, of course, the other main character who is also struggling with balance is Otto. Doc Ock is such a layered villain that mirrors Peter perfectly. As I said way before, Otto appears to have everything. Working on this energy source to make a difference is Otto's quote-unquote Spider-Man. It's the right thing and it leaves him fulfilled. But of course, not everyone is perfect. Bad things will happen even when what you're doing is right. His experiment fails and he loses everything. Otto is a little bit arrogant. He has an ego. So the arms get to him and convince him to follow his dream at any cost. He loses track of why this was his dream in the first place, to make a difference. Instead, the end goal is all that matters. Otto doesn't give himself a chance to be steady, to get back on his feet. He is feeding that side of him that does please his ego. In a way, Otto gave up his Spider-Man to chase his dreams. So in the end, Peter, Harry, and Otto are all struggling to find that balance. Peter goes on that arc, Harry doesn't, and Otto is reminded by the help of Peter, which is what makes the ending so powerful and personal. Peter goes to Otto and tells him what he has learned. He reminds Otto of why he is doing all of this, the responsibility of it, and Otto changes. He gives his life to stop the machine. In the end, gave up his dream to do the right thing, and as a result, Otto didn't die a monster. The whole theme of the movie and the arc that Peter goes on is unlike anything I've seen in a superhero movie. It's not a sexy message, but it's one that's so important. It's not surprising to me how well this movie has aged. It's so deep to so many people and it resonates so personally. The movie ends with Peter finally getting MJ, which is another great payoff of two movies. I love this movie, and by the time I am done reviewing all 8 of these live-action Spider-Man movies, I would be shocked if this movie wasn't my favorite. Spider-Man 2 scored a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes, along with an 82% audience score. The movie would also score a 7.5 out of 10 on IMDb. Spider-Man 2 would end up grossing $786 million at the box office, making it the 3rd highest grossing movie of the year. Spider-Man 2 was a success by basically every metric, so the 3rd movie was instantly put into development. Spider-Man 2 writer Alvin Sargent was brought on to write Spider-Man 3 and even signed an option to write a Spider-Man 4. Now, the earliest stages of the production for Spider-Man 3 are pretty well known to most people in the community. Sam Raimi and his brother spent 2 months writing a treatment for this movie. The main villain of the movie would be Sandman, and it would mostly explore Peter discovering that there's humanity in the villains that he fights. However, Sony producer Avi Arad thought that the villains in the previous 2 movies were too niche, and he wanted a more well-known and popular villain for this 3rd movie. That is why he wanted Venom to be in this movie, who is arguably Spider-Man's most popular villain. Raimi hated Venom. He felt like Venom had no humanity to him, and it also went completely against the themes of his treatment he just wrote. However, Raimi lost the fight, and he was forced to include Venom in his movie. Allegedly, the Vulture was also considered to be in this movie, but thankfully that idea was scrapped. Principal photography began in November of 2005 and concluded in July of 2006. There were no major problems during the production of this movie, but it was an extensive and demanding shoot. It was said Raimi would need to shuttle between up to 7 working sets at one time. However, Spider-Man 3 was completed on time and released on May 4th, 2007. So, Spider-Man 3 is not a very good movie. Now, with that being said, I'm quite surprised that this movie was once considered to be genuinely awful, because it's not even close. Many people have pointed out that the multitude of villains is the biggest reason why this movie isn't very strong. Because Raimi wanted to focus on Sandman, but Avi Arad wanted to focus on Venom, and since they're both in the movie, there's not really enough time to develop either one. This is definitely a factor, and I'll dive deeper into this in a bit. Another factor I haven't heard discussed enough is how convenient a lot of the events in the movie are. Instead of there being a natural flow of events happening, it feels like certain things happen simply because they need to happen. The first 2 movies were somewhat like this, but the 3rd movie is on another level. These factors that I just mentioned are important, but to be honest, the biggest reason why I don't find this movie to be very good is because of Peter and his character arc. I don't think his story flows in a way that's nearly as powerful as it did in the previous 2 movies. So while I wouldn't say this movie stinks and while I wouldn't say it's awful, I feel like Peter's arc leads to an ending that's a bit anticlimactic and a bit unearned. So Peter's story begins with everything going well. Life couldn't be better for him. People love Spider-Man. He's actually balancing his personal life like school. Him and MJ are doing great. Peter is happy. Things are going so well for Peter that he wants to dismiss any problem in his life. He doesn't want anything to risk interrupting his new perfect life. This is most notable with MJ. MJ's having trouble at work. Reviews of her most recent performance weren't great. Now, Peter isn't straight up neglectful of MJ when she expresses her frustrations, but he kind of diminishes her problems. He doesn't treat them seriously. He is taking the easiest route in his life to fix his problems. Instead of listening to her, he tells her to just brush her problems aside. If he can do it as Spider-Man, then she can do it as an actress. He's telling her how to fix her problems instead of just listening to her talk about them. This, of course, doesn't go well, especially because she is going to bury her problems, which only makes things worse. The same thing kind of happens with Harry. So Harry and Peter are beefing because Harry learned the truth about Peter at the end of the previous movie. Early on in the movie, Peter and Harry fight, which leads to Harry injuring himself and getting amnesia. By the way, this is one of the many conveniences that I spoke about. The writers clearly needed time to develop the other villains in the movie, so might as well have Harry forget his main motivation for a significant part of the story. After Harry wakes up, Peter doesn't tell Harry the truth because it would create another problem in his life. Why would Peter create a problem when one was just resolved? I don't entirely love this because telling a hard truth is something that Peter did in the previous movie with Aunt May, so him not doing it here is a bit of a regression. But Peter is a human being, so I'm not going to flame the movie for this. Going back to MJ, because of Peter's lackluster emotional support, she doesn't tell him that she was fired. This causes a rift between the two that Peter doesn't even know about. At this point in the movie, Peter met with May because he wanted to tell her he plans on proposing to MJ. May is so happy, so she tells him a man must be understanding, to put his wife first. When Peter and May have a one-on-one conversation, that usually means they're going to talk about the theme of the movie. So after this conversation, I thought this would be a key part of his character arc, but it kind of isn't, as we'll touch on later. At the dinner where Peter plans on proposing, MJ berates him and storms away, leaving Peter confused. Now this leads me into one big criticism I have. Peter does things in this movie that I just don't buy Peter Parker doing. Sure, I can buy his ego being inflated because of the praise Spider-Man is getting, but him kissing another girl seems so unlike him. I didn't like that. It seemed unnecessary, especially since Peter knew MJ was watching him. It's really strange. Peter and May learn the truth that Flint Marko was really the man that killed Uncle Ben, and that he escaped prison. I really don't like them changing who killed Ben. It's too cheap. It's too easy of a way to develop a personal relationship between Peter and this new villain, and it's at the expense of a plot point from a previous movie. Anyway, MJ stops by to console Peter, but since he's so angry, he shuts himself off emotionally completely from her. He just tells her he is fine, and MJ gets the message and leaves. This only distances them further. Shortly afterwards, the symbiote attaches itself to Peter. Again, talk about convenience. This alien symbiote crashes from space right next to Spider-Man in the middle of the night. There's nothing organic here. A plot point literally just falls from the sky. The beginning of the villain's stories in the previous two movies felt organic in terms of how it entered Peter's life. There is nothing less organic than something just falling out of the sky. This being how Venom enters the story is clearly a result of Raimi not wanting Venom to be in the movie, because he clearly didn't know how to include Venom organically, so it feels inorganic. And also, in a way, it takes away agency from Peter. Peter being a bit of an asshole should not be because of some symbiote. It should be because Peter is going on a character arc. Just tone down the rudeness and edginess a bit, and it's a lot more realistic. And as we'll touch on later, Eddie Brock is borderline useless in this story. So after hearing the news, Peter hunts down Flint Marko and pretty much kills him. This is what his intention was, so that's all that matters. At this point in the movie, things just don't go right for Peter. MJ breaks up with Peter. Peter goes out of his way to ruin Eddie's life, which he kind of deserved because as a photographer, he submitted a fake photo. But regardless, Eddie's life is ruined. May is disappointed that Spider-Man would kill someone. Peter then attacks Harry, and then Peter has his super edgy phase and hurts MJ. Peter is kind of spiraling here. By the way, I get all the criticisms of Bully Maguire. It's cringe and it's funny, but I think that's the point of the movie. The movie wants you to cringe at Peter. So even though I chuckled because I'm familiar with all the memes, I don't hate it. I think it's the point. Going back to what actually matters, after hurting MJ, this is when Peter realizes he must change. Peter ignored all his problems, tried to take the easy path, and look where it led him. Peter gets rid of the symbiote and then talks to May, which is when the theme of the movie is established. Peter really screwed up, but in order to move on, he must forgive himself. The central theme of this movie seems to be about forgiveness, which also applies to the three main villains of the movie. All these movies are about Peter struggling with something internally. He needs to acknowledge what he's struggling with and then grow because of it. In this movie, Peter was struggling with something internally, and the end result is just to have him forgive himself. I feel like they're not directly addressing the problems that Peter had in the first half of the movie. Peter's persistence in maintaining the status quo at any cost is never addressed again. He just needs to forgive himself and the villains. This is not a fair arc for Peter. It's not like this whole movie began because of Peter's unwillingness to forgive himself or someone else. This movie needed to actually address the issue in the beginning of the movie, and it doesn't. Peter low-key doesn't face the consequences of his actions. He just needs to forgive himself, and it leads to a pretty anticlimactic final fight. Sure, I'll give the sequence here some props that the action is pretty damn good, but what's at stake emotionally here? Nothing. Peter isn't going into this fight with the mindset he needs to forgive Harry, Flint, or Eddie. Yeah, Harry forgives Peter, but that wasn't a result of anything Peter did. Peter should be blessed that Harry's butler finally talked to Harry, but more on that later. With Eddie isn't able to forgive Peter, so he ends up dying. And then with Flint just shows up and tells the truth, and Peter decides to forgive him. This doesn't feel as well thought out as the other two movies, and that's a shame. So I don't love Peter's arc in this story. It never actually addressed the problems he was going through, and it led to an unsatisfying end. Let's talk about the villains, and how each one I found to be pretty weak to varying degrees. Let's begin with Harry. Harry attacks Peter relatively early on in the movie, but since the script needs time to develop Flint and the symbiote, Harry gets amnesia, which, as I said before, is a pretty big convenience for the story. Harry is then chilling for most of the movie. After a hangout session with MJ where he kisses her, he then gets visions of his father and remembers everything. Convenient. He gets his revenge on Peter, which then leads to Peter getting his revenge back and literally scarring Harry. At this point, I guess the movie is arguing that Harry needs to forgive Peter, but the thing is, Harry doesn't really forgive Peter. He just learns the truth about what happened that night his father died. There was nothing to forgive Peter for. Peter didn't kill Norman. Also, it's pretty convenient that Harry's butler waited all this time and all these years to tell Harry the truth. That would have been convenient a long time ago. So after one conversation, Harry quote-unquote forgives Peter and teams up with him. Harry helps Peter fight and gives his life to protect Peter. This is something that his father would have never done. In a way, it's a completion of a trilogy-long arc for Harry. He had spent so much time being consumed by his father's approval all throughout the trilogy. But in the end, he finally removed himself from his father's shadow and he did what was right. On paper, I don't hate this, but I don't think it was entirely earned. All Harry did was listen to his butler and then he turned good. He never actually dealt with his daddy issues and why he was so desperate for his dad's approval. Both Harry and Peter don't go on arcs that are earned. They each have one conversation and then change. The actual work that goes into a person changing doesn't happen here. So Harry's story ends in a way that isn't climactic at all. Let's talk about Flint Marko, aka Sandman. Because, to be honest, I'm quite surprised many people say he is the one bright spot of this movie, because I think he's just as shallow as the rest of the villains. So Flint's entire motivation in this movie is that his daughter is sick and he wants to help her. So he goes around town stealing money to presumably help his daughter. Sure, this is a decent way to build a foundation for a villain, but that's just his entire character. It's not like Flint is all that clever or menacing. Pretty much every sequence that he's in after he becomes the Sandman begins with him just casually walking around and then someone confronts him. This happens 3 times. Also, correct me if I'm wrong because I might be missing something. What is he stealing the money for? Is he stealing the money for research? Is he stealing the money to pay bills? Because that's all he's doing in the movie is stealing money, and they don't ever explain what he's doing with it. In the end, his role in the final fight is Eddie going up to him and saying, "Hey, you find Spider-Man annoying, right? Want to fight him?" And Flint is like, "Sure." It's not like there's a promise of money or help for his daughter. There's no organic flow here. In the previous 2 movies, there was a reason for the final fight other than, "I want to attack Spider-Man," while here it is literally just, again, "I want to attack Spider-Man." Is there something that happens during the final fight that leads to Flint wanting to confess the truth to Peter? No. He was just hammering at him 1 minute, and then 5 minutes later, he's just standing at the top telling the truth. Also, there's no resolution for his character. He just tells the truth and flies away. Did he help his daughter? I couldn't tell you. Flint is a fine villain, but he's far from a good one. A truly bad villain would be Venom. Venom and Eddie Brock are just not necessary to this movie. In fact, he doesn't really cross over with any other storyline until the end when he casually walks up to Flint Marko. Eddie is a really hollow character. He just wants to be loved and has no identity because of it. So things go wrong for Eddie. Again, talk about the perfect convenience for the plot. Peter happens to go to the church that Eddie is at to get rid of the symbiote. It's just convenience. It's not meaningful narrative progression. What is his motivation in the end? I'm mad at Spider-Man, I want to kill him. I think in the end, they killed Eddie as a way of saying Eddie couldn't forgive Peter and that was his demise. It's just so shallow, and it's also comical in the way that he dies. Spider-Man 3 is not a good movie, and that's unfortunate because it led to a pretty big change with the franchise. Spider-Man 3 scored a 62% on Rotten Tomatoes, along with a 51% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 6.3 out of 10. Spider-Man 3 grossed $885 million at the box office, making it not only the third highest grossing movie of 2007, but also the highest grossing movie of the trilogy. However, the fallout of Spider-Man 3 led to some tension between Sam Raimi and Sony. A Spider-Man 4 was put into production, and it was given a release date of May 6th, 2011. Raimi wasn't happy with how Spider-Man 3 went, so with Spider-Man 4, he wanted a lot more creative control to give his story a satisfying and emotional ending. However, the script kept going through extensive rewrites, and it left Raimi unhappy with the direction of the project. In January of 2010, it was announced that Sam Raimi would be leaving the project, and as a result, Spider-Man 4 was cancelled. This led to the reboot of the entire Spider-Man franchise, and The Amazing Spider-Man was put into production. Allegedly, there wasn't as much of a wide director's search for this movie as there was with the first Spider-Man movie. Catherine Bigelow and David Fincher were considered for the job, but shortly afterward, Marc Webb was selected for the director's chair. Marc Webb was a bit newer to the film industry, only having one directorial feature under his belt with 500 Days of Summer. Webb was a big fan of the Raimi films, but he made it an emphasis that he wanted to present a new version of Spider-Man to audiences. Retreading exactly what Raimi did with Tobey Maguire was not going to work. He wanted the movie to have a different tone, and while having the same heart as Peter Parker, he wanted it to be noticeably different as well. Many actors were considered for the new Peter Parker. Michael Angarano, Drake Bell, Jamie Bell, Frank Delane, Alden Ehrenreich, Josh Hutcherson, Aaron Johnson, Joe Jonas, Logan Lerman, and Anton Yelchin were all considered for the role. But on July 1st, 2010, it was announced that Andrew Garfield was officially going to play Peter Parker. Now, instead of going down the route of recasting MJ, this movie would bring in Gwen Stacy to serve as Peter's love interest. Gwen was in Spider-Man 3, but she had a pretty minor role compared to what she would get in The Amazing Spider-Man. Diana Agron, Lily Collins, Georgina Haag, Ophelia Lovibond, Dominique McElligott, and Mia Wasikowska were all considered for Gwen. But in October of 2010, Emma Stone was announced to be playing the character. It was said that Stone and Garfield had instant chemistry during screen tests, and this played a huge factor into having Stone cast. When it came to crafting Peter Parker, Webb wanted these movies to focus a lot more on Peter's intelligence, which wasn't a major factor with the Raimi trilogy. Instead of having natural web shooters, Garfield's Spider-Man would have artificial web shooters, something that Peter would build for himself. This emphasis on reinventing Spider-Man was a key focus all throughout the production. Principal photography began in December of 2010 and concluded 5 months later in May of 2011. A little over a year later, on July 3rd, 2012, The Amazing Spider-Man was released in theaters. Now, before diving deep into this first movie, I want to give my overall perspective on both films and what conclusions I came to. It had been a long time since I'd watched these two movies, so while I remembered the plot and all the major character beats, the specifics of how the movie was constructed was lost on me. One thing I had been aware of was just how much love and appreciation these movies had gotten in the past few years. Rarely do I see movies that most people agree aren't that good, but still have a pretty big audience. It's not uncommon for someone went to say that Andrew Garfield is their favorite Spider-Man. The only other movies I can think of off the top of my head that somewhat resemble the fandom of these films are the Star Wars prequels. Those movies are pretty bad, yet they have so many fans. I find movies like these to be so interesting, because if it's not just the quality of these movies that bring people back to them, then what is it? So I rewatched the two Amazing Spider-Man movies, and things became pretty clear to me. One is that the mandate that Webb had to make these movies different from the Raimi films is definitely present. After watching these first 5 films nearly back to back, the Webb movies are much different than the Raimi movies. And by the way, I think this is a great thing. If you're gonna have multiple iterations of this character, then you owe it to audiences to give us different interpretations of the character. This isn't like Lord of the Rings, where there is one source material that needs to be followed. Superheroes have had so many different interpretations, so I love that this movie is so different. Now, another thing that cannot be ignored are my biases. I may not be the biggest Spider-Man fan in the world, but what is true is that I grew up on the Raimi films. I vividly remember being 6 or 7 in 2004 and wearing the Spider-Man suit around my apartment. I loved those movies so much. I even remember loving the third movie too when I was around 10. So a lot of the things that I love about Spider-Man came from those movies, not some comic book. So watching the Amazing Spider-Man movies, I had to remind myself that certain things I didn't love aren't negatives of the movie, it's just my personal preference. I know a lot of people have discussed Andrew's Peter riding his skateboard a lot, so while that doesn't match my vision of Peter Parker in my head, I'm not gonna sit here and complain about that because that's not fair to the movie. At the end of the day, I am happier that these movies are much different. So with that out of the way, what is my big conclusion about these movies? Marc Webb clearly understands Spider-Man. In both movies, there are these moments that just scream Spider-Man to me. The scene in the first movie where Peter saves the kid from that car is probably my favorite scene in either movie. It's also fair to say that these scenes in these two movies are the best Spider-Man specific scenes we have ever gotten. There is nothing in the Raimi films that warmed my heart as much as this scene in the first Webb movie. I would also argue that a lot of the character dynamics between Peter and his friends or family are a lot stronger in these movies. One criticism of the Raimi films that I didn't bring up in my video that I have is that Peter's relationships to Harry and MJ aren't the strongest. I just can't picture Peter and Harry being best friends, and Peter and MJ don't have the greatest chemistry either. Peter and Gwen in the Amazing Spider-Man movies are running circles around the previous Peter and MJ in terms of chemistry. Credit to the casting department. Garfield and Stone are great together. I love their chemistry. So to me, it is clear why these movies have such strong fans. How can you be a Spider-Man fan and not love the last scene of the second movie? That scene is so perfectly Spider-Man. Now with that being said, the reason I don't think these movies are very good is because the writers could not successfully string together these beautiful moments into a coherent and compelling narrative. Both these movies are a mess. They both have so much going on, and they fail to successfully weave together everything that is going on. Oftentimes, especially with the first movie, the seeds are planted there for something great, but they're never watered enough to bloom into something special. With that all out of the way, now we can dive deeper into these movies specifically. What are these beautiful moments, and how do the movies fail to bring them all together? Let's begin by diving deep into the first Amazing Spider-Man. So this first Amazing Spider-Man movie is pretty much all about grief and fatherhood. A huge pillar for this version of Peter is the death of his father, which I actually really liked because that was something that was completely missing from the previous movies. Now, throughout this movie, Peter picks up 3 father figures. The first one is Uncle Ben, the second one is Kurt Connors, and the third and final one is kind of Officer Stacy. This movie is a coming-of-age story. So what this movie does is use those 3 father figures to help Peter come of age. Now on paper, so many of these elements so obviously could make a great story, but the writers clearly didn't know how to tie these elements together into hammering home their own message. This is what I'm going to dive into. So the beginning of the movie focuses very much on the absence of Peter's father and how that has impacted him. Ben tries to be there to console him, but it's not enough. So this leads to Peter seeking out answers at Oscorp, which leads him to Kurt Connors. This obviously leads Peter to getting bit by the spider, where he becomes Spider-Man. And this
This also leads to Peter forming a stronger relationship with Connors. Now, the beginning of the movie focuses a lot on Peter's relationship with Ben. One thing I really appreciate about Ben in this movie is that he feels a lot more like a real person compared to the previous Ben. This Ben has multiple conversations with Peter. On multiple occasions, he talks to Peter to try to help him out with what he is going through. Now, this Peter, much more than the previous one, is prone to abusing his power. He takes much more joy in embarrassing Flash, and once he really starts attacking criminals, he takes great joy in it. Now, since Peter is a moody teenager, this leads to a heated back and forth between Ben and Peter. Peter expresses how the absence of his father is really hurting him, which leads to him storming off. Ben follows, and this leads to Ben's death. Now, because the movie has emphasized repeatedly how the death of a father has impacted Peter his whole life, the death of Ben, another father figure, hits a lot harder solely because of that. Now, the impact that Ben's death has on Peter is a lot different in these movies than the previous ones. In the Raimi movies, it was Ben's words about "with great power comes great responsibility" that motivate Peter to do good. In this movie, I don't know if this was the goal or not, but Ben's death doesn't lead him towards doing good. Ben's death leads to two things: Peter getting closer to Connors, and Peter taking out his anger on criminals. So with the criminals, Peter spends a lot of time searching for Ben's killer. While he doesn't ever find Ben's killer, he does spend a lot of time beating up criminals, humiliating them, and handing them over to the police. I don't hate this change at all. It's a new direction to take the character, and had the rest of the movie been much better, this could have been much better. Now, I'll be honest, I personally like the Raimi direction better. I like Uncle Ben being a key pillar of Peter's identity, but I can't say I hate the direction this movie took. So overall, I really liked what they did with Uncle Ben. Let's now talk about Connors, because he's arguably the second most important character in this movie. Connors is so interesting to me because in the first half of the movie, they did such a great job building the foundation of his character and his relationship with Peter, only to completely fumble it in the second half of the movie. So after the death of Uncle Ben, it's clear that Peter turns to Connors as his next father figure. And for the first half of the movie, this really works. Because of all the characters in this movie, Connors is the one that mirrors Peter the best. Marc Webb has stated that both Peter and Connors use their powers to fill a hole in their life. Peter uses Spider-Man to fill that hole that his father's death left, and Connors uses the Lizard to fill the hole that missing an arm has left. Both characters are also supposed to be outcasts, and both are more prone to the power they now possess. Now, it's not entirely the same, but when both gain their powers, both use their powers to get personal vengeance. Peter goes after criminals, and Connors goes after people who have wronged him. Now, because Peter is a hero and Connors is the villain, both go down different paths. Peter has a conversation with Officer Stacy where Officer Stacy challenges Spider-Man. He says that Spider-Man seems more concerned with going after his enemies rather than actually helping people. This conversation does change Peter, because after this moment is when he goes to the bridge to help people in need. After this moment, never again does Peter spend time looking for Ben's killer. Connors, on the other hand, doesn't ever make this change. He keeps pursuing his own goals and then wants to force change on everyone else. Now, pretty much everything up to here I really like, but this is also where the missed opportunities start to rise. Connors' turn into the Lizard was mishandled pretty significantly. In the first half of the movie, to me, there was no inclination of Connors turning into a villain. Yeah, he has his insecurities over his missing arm, and yes, he sees it as a weakness that needs to be fixed, but after he injects himself with the serum, he just goes from 0 to 100. He now feels like he needs to fix the entire world of weakness. He has no problem killing people, and he has no problem going out of his way to fight Peter in a high school. Clearly, there is some sort of mental element going on here with the serum, but this movie doesn't really explain it at all. We just have to infer it, and I don't like that. Apparently, there were a ton of deleted scenes that highlighted these parts of Connor's story better, but these scenes were deleted, so that character development is lost. I'm also so tired of the serum turns villain crazy trope. I didn't hate it with the Green Goblin, but here it doesn't work. Now, the way the writers really mishandled Connors and his turn to evil was with how it impacts Peter. I feel like there was a clear way Connors' turn should have impacted Peter, but it didn't. The first is how the Lizard is supposed to mirror Spider-Man. Both Peter and Connors use their powers to fill that void in their heart, and both, for a time, use their powers a bit in a selfish way. When Connors talks to Peter about this, Peter straight up stopping Connors and taking away his powers is supposed to give Peter some pause, because Peter is supposed to get Connors. He's supposed to be able to relate to what Connors is going through. So him straight up saying, "I'm gonna stop you," is not supposed to happen. Peter should have to really think about it and use that as a reflection on himself. Why would Peter rob someone else of the very thing that made him feel better? It's a great hero/villain dynamic, and it's simply not explored. Connors turns evil, and Peter completely acknowledges that he needs to stop him. And that's it. Again, there was a deleted scene that allegedly showed Peter struggling with this. In that scene, Connors makes the point that I made about why Peter would struggle with this, but this scene isn't in the final movie, so it is just a missed opportunity. Now, there's arguably a more important deleted scene that takes place shortly after Ben's death. Connor goes to give Peter his condolences, and he tells Peter, "We must be greater than what we suffer." This is a perfect Spider-Man line, one that would perfectly apply to the conflict between these two characters. But again, the scene is not present in the movie, so the ending doesn't actually pay off this great line. Now, maybe the more important point to mention here is how Connors is supposed to be Peter's father figure at this point in the movie. Peter has lost his father, he has lost Ben, so Peter should really value the role Connors is playing in his life right now. When Connors becomes the Lizard and starts killing people, Peter shouldn't just have reservations because of how Spider-Man and the Lizard mirror each other, he should also have reservations because Connors is the last father figure he has left. Does Peter really want to kill the man who has been there for him recently? This is an excellent moral dilemma for Spider-Man to have, because another big theme about Spider-Man for me is sacrifice. The best Spider-Man moment in any movie is when Peter has to make a tough sacrifice. He has to make a decision that will make Peter's life a lot harder, but he does it because he knows that is the right thing to do, and that is what Spider-Man represents. So this final fight between Peter and Connors should really have so much emotional weight behind it, but it doesn't. It should have Peter struggling with the fact that he needs to stop the one father figure he has left, but it doesn't. After Connors becomes the Lizard, Peter seems to completely forget that this man is supposed to be a father figure to him. He just casually goes to Officer Stacy to report Connors with no hesitation. This is so missing the point of the character. It's so unfortunate. This is the biggest way the Amazing Spider-Man failed to weave in a compelling story built on beautiful moments. Now, the last point I want to bring up is the role that Officer Stacy plays and how it impacts the end of the movie. Because frankly, Peter's last line in the movie where he gladly wants to break his promise to Officer Stacy really rubbed me the wrong way, especially given the events of the second movie. So in the third act of this movie, Peter reveals himself to Officer Stacy in order to save Gwen. Officer Stacy listens and lets Peter go. In the final fight, Stacy is killed, but he talks to Peter one last time. He asks Peter to promise to him that he will keep Gwen out of any Spider-Man related business. To keep her safe, Peter agrees, and then Stacy dies. Now, the most effective way for Peter to protect Gwen is simply to not be with her. This is what he tells Gwen close to the end of the movie. However, right before the credits roll, Peter jokes that he will go back on that promise, Gwen smiles, and the movie ends. When the second movie begins, Peter and Gwen are together. I really hate this. Imagine if the first Raimi movie ended with Peter letting MJ go because he wanted to protect her, only to walk right back to her, saying, "Just kidding," and then he kisses her. It would be awful, and that's what kind of happens here. Now, the deeper reason this decision upsets me is because of Peter's character development in this movie. The number one character trait for Peter in this movie are his daddy issues. To have Peter so easily ignore Gwen's dad's last words after struggling all movie to find meaning in his relationship with his father feels so wrong to me. Also, so much of Peter's identity is him finding meaning in Uncle Ben's last words. At least that's how it should be. So to have Peter throw away Officer Stacy's last wishes in regards to his daughter Gwen feels wrong. Now, I wouldn't expect Peter to never struggle with this. If in the second movie Peter decided to be with Gwen, I would be fine with it. The problem is that it happens so quickly after he made that promise. I also think if Peter and Gwen don't get together here, it makes the second movie much stronger. In the second movie, close to the beginning, Peter Peter and Gwen break up over this promise again. So if you watch these two movies, Peter breaks up with Gwen, he gets back together with her, he breaks up with her again, they get back together, and then Gwen dies. Why not cut out the middle portion where you have Peter breaking up with Gwen, and instead he gets back together with her midway through the sequel, and then Gwen dies? I also think it makes Gwen's death hit that much harder if we know that between the two movies, Peter had been yearning for Gwen the whole time, only for him to lose her right after he got her back. That would make the movie even more heartbreaking. So Peter going back on his promise so quickly undermines so much of the emotional weight of this movie for me. And as I said before, that's the theme of this movie. Great moments bogged down by an inability to bring them all together. The Amazing Spider-Man is not an awful movie, but it's not a good movie, and it left a lot on the table. The Amazing Spider-Man scored a 71% on Rotten Tomatoes, along with a 77% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 6.9 out of 10. The Amazing Spider-Man grossed $757 million at the box office, making it the 7th highest grossing movie of 2012. Sony was fairly happy with the performance of The Amazing Spider-Man, so the sequel was greenlit. Initially, there was some doubt about whether or not Marc Webb would be returning for the director's chair. This was because of some contract disputes. However, in September 2012, it was confirmed that Marc Webb would return to direct The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and that Garfield would reprise his role as Spider-Man. There's not that many interesting stories to talk about with the production of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Allegedly, Shailene Woodley was cast as MJ, and scenes with her were filmed, but all those scenes were cut from the final movie. Principal photography ran from February of 2013 to June of 2013. Now, a big storyline surrounding the production of this movie was the studio meddling. During the post-production, a lot of the movie was cut out, and a big focus was put on setting up a cinematic universe, so it could be more like the MCU. And as we'll get into, all this studio meddling leads to the final product being an unfocused mess. But despite that, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 was finished on time and released on May 2nd, 2014. Now, The Amazing Spider-Man 2 is a much more extreme version of the first movie. One thing I would argue this movie has over the first movie is a little bit of the sauce. There are some impressive shots in this movie. I always thought the first movie was a little dull visually, so to see this movie step up in that department was nice. The shot of Spider-Man saving those people on the streets was sick, and the shot of Gwen falling is genuinely beautiful. Also, this movie does have some of the best Spider-Man moments of the franchise. Peter and Gwen have the best romance of any Spider-Man movie in this movie. Their chemistry is off the charts, and so many of their scenes are so sweet. Also, the ending of the movie where Peter returns and rescues that little boy is such a beautiful moment. However, despite these moments, this movie as a whole is much more of a mess compared to the first movie. This is one of the messiest movies I have ever seen. There is so much shit going on, and at least to me, almost none of it connects. And what does connect is such a stretch. There are 4 distinct plot lines in this movie: the conspiracy with Peter's dad, Electro becoming a villain, Harry becoming a villain, and Peter managing his relationship with Gwen. The movie is spread so thin trying to develop these storylines that none of them, besides maybe the Gwen storyline, feel meaningful. To make matters worse, none of these storylines really connect at all. They're all completely separate from each other, and it creates some really strange pacing. When I looked up what is the message of The Amazing Spider-Man 2, allegedly this movie is about time. How there is not enough of it and you need to spend a lot of your time choosing your own path and appreciating what you have. This is basically what Gwen's speech is about in the beginning of the movie. Now maybe I'm stupid, but this theme of time I feel is barely explored throughout the rest of the movie. And when it is, it feels so hollow. Let's begin by talking about Peter trying to uncover the conspiracy about his dad. So the movie begins with a flashback where we see what happened to Peter's parents. They wanted to kill the Spider Project, but were then killed by Oscorp because of it. After this opening sequence, this storyline is pretty much ignored for an entire hour. Yeah, we know from the previous movie that the loss of Peter's dad weighs heavily on him, but in this movie that is just not as much of a factor. In regards to the other storylines with Max, Harry, or Gwen, Gwen, the death of Peter's father doesn't matter at all. So to have it come up out of the blue later on in this movie feels so weird. So Peter starts investigating what happened, and then later he throws the calculator at the wall where he finds coins, which leads him to his dad's secret underground lab where he then learns the truth about what happened. Everything that happened here was so convoluted that Peter needed to find these coins, to find the railroad, to find the secret lab. This is just too much going on. This isn't a Da Vinci Code movie. Also, the fact that this is combined with a mini storyline of May studying to become a nurse is just another thing that prevents this movie from being focused. Now, with the first movie, I didn't have a problem with Peter's parents being people of importance. I kind of like Peter being a complete nobody better, like in the Raimi movies, but I don't hate it here. In this movie, it's made to seem like Peter's dad is one of the smartest people ever, and the fact that only Peter could become Spider-Man because his dad put his own DNA in this spider venom was comical to me. I'm sorry, I low-key hate when these movies bring up too much fake science stuff. I get it's a Spider-Man movie, so I have to somewhat suspend my disbelief, but this is just too much. Now, in the message from Peter's dad, he does say, "I wish I had more time," so in that respect, it does tie into the theme of the movie, but not really. You can't just have Peter's dad say this and then boom, this whole storyline is now thematically relevant. After Peter learns the truth and finds the lab, this plotline is never brought up again. It doesn't impact anything else that is going on. Now, all this was probably brought up because it would be relevant in the next movie had it actually happened, but we never got an Amazing Spider-Man 3, so this storyline is just a waste of time. Let's now talk about Max Dillon, aka Electro, a truly awful villain. Now, as far as I'm aware, his storyline has nothing to do with time or whatever. He just solely exists so there can be a bad guy in the end. Nothing about his story is thematically relevant. So in the beginning of the movie, Peter saves Max from getting hurt, and Max loves this. We also learn that Max is not only a big Spider-Man fan, but he also works at Oscorp. He also built the electrical grid where the final fight is going to be, and he will also be the one who falls into a pool of electric eels to become Electro. How convenient. His story seems to be centered around wanting attention. He seems to have no family or friends, and he gets bullied at work. All Max wants is attention. He wants the love of the people. It's fair to say that Max doesn't love Spider-Man. He loves the idea of someone getting as much love as Spider-Man gets. So eventually he becomes Electro and shows up in Times Square. There he gets a taste of that attention he craves, but then Spider-Man shows up and allegedly steals the spotlight from him, and this was enough to turn Max into a supervillain where he wants to kill people. He is stopped by Peter, however, and then he pretty much disappears for an hour. He gets interrogated during a hilarious scene where he says, "I am Electro." Eventually, Harry comes to free Max just so Max can fight Peter at the end. There is nothing less interesting to me than a Spider-Man movie where the climax features the villains fighting Peter because they just hate Peter, and that's it. So down at the electrical grid, we have a final fight between Max and Peter, and while it was pretty cool visually, it is as shallow as you can get thematically. Peter manages to stop Max, and that's it. You can tell the writers realized how shallow this fight was because they had to throw in some random plane that was going to crash if Electro wasn't stopped. Does this plane have anything to do with any character? No, it was just thrown in to create stakes. It was so shameless, I cannot remember ever seeing anything like it. Max Dillon, aka Electro, was an awful villain, and the fact they turned Jamie Foxx into a nerd only makes things worse. Let's now talk about Harry because he is arguably the more important villain. Now, the whole setup for Harry is really weird because we need to buy that he and Peter are really close friends, despite Harry not being mentioned a single time in the first movie, and that Peter worked at his dad's company. If Harry being Peter's friend wasn't a part of the Spider-Man lore, then the sequence feels like it comes out of nowhere. Now, the whole gist of Harry's story in this movie is that his father just died of some sort of disease, and since that disease is genetic, Harry has it too. He spends the movie trying to figure out how to cure himself before he suffers the same fate as his father. Now, this does somewhat tie into the main theme of the movie with valuing time. Harry is going to die soon if he doesn't do something about his disease. Now, I don't particularly love Harry's story because I find him to be a pretty two-dimensional character. He has one scene with his father where some daddy issues are established, but after that, everything about Harry is just trying to survive. Harry in the Raimi films was far from being the best best part of those movies, but at least over the course of the entire trilogy, those daddy issues were well developed. We understood why his father and his legacy mattered so much to Harry. Here with this movie, since it's so cluttered, we don't have a strong understanding of why Harry is like this. Also, it's a bit confusing what this disease is. Harry is 20 in this movie, and the movie treats Harry like he's weeks away from dying. I think it could have served the story and the themes a lot better if Harry still had like 20 to 30 years left to live. This way you could argue thematically that Harry is wasting all his time and risking his life trying to beat this disease when he still has a solid 30 years left to live. But the writers don't do that, so it's whatever. Now, Harry's story also falls victim to the pseudoscience in this movie that I really don't like. The scene where Harry goes to Peter and is like, "You can get me Spider-Man's blood because you're his photographer." It was hilarious. I can't explain it. Something about trying to get someone else's blood is a storyline I typically hate. Also, as this has been pointed out, Harry thinking Peter knows Spider-Man because he took his photo once is hilarious. Now, of course, because Spider-Man won't give Harry his blood, Harry becomes hateful and devotes the rest of the movie to hurting Spider-Man. Peter would have been better off if he never went to Harry in the first place to tell Harry he couldn't give him his blood, because this leads to Harry becoming the Green Goblin and attacking Peter because he hates Spider-Man now. Again, it's so shallow, I hate it. Harry's story, like so much of this movie, doesn't have any depth to it, and it barely ties into the themes of the overall movie. Let's wrap up the discussion of this movie by talking about Peter and Gwen, the clear best part of the movie. Like I said before, their chemistry is infectious. These two are so great together, so when Gwen dies, it does feel devastating. Now, there are some nuances about their relationship I don't love. I think this movie is much stronger if my rewrite from the first movie was the story here. I don't love the whole back and forth of Peter and Gwen being together and then not being together. Once is fine, but more than that is too much. I also think their kiss on the top of the bridge hits a lot harder if that was their first time in the movie they were officially a couple. Now, this next change I'd like to propose is a bit of a difficult one to suggest, considering the third Amazing Spider-Man movie never happened. I think there's a lot of power in letting certain character decisions sit for a long time. At the end of this movie, Peter gives up being Spider-Man, but only 5 screen minutes later does he put the suit back on. If the movie ended with Peter giving up Spider-Man, and then the third movie showed him putting the suit back on and giving him an arc, that would have been much better. But again, that third movie never would have happened, so do I really want to suggest this change? If Peter ends this second movie giving up on being Spider-Man movie, and then the Amazing Spider-Man 3 never happens, can we actually have Andrew show up in No Way Home? I'm not sure. The main point that I'm trying to make is that I think the story could have done a bit more with Gwen's death, but I also acknowledge that without a third movie, a lot of my ideas can't be realized. Regardless, this whole dynamic is still clearly the best part of the movie because everything else is unorganized and a huge mess. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 scored a 50% on Rotten Tomatoes along with a 64% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 6.6 out of 10. The Amazing Spider-Man 2 would end up grossing $708 million at the box office, so by no means a bomb, but that did make it only the 9th highest grossing movie of the year, and the lowest grossing Spider-Man movie up to that point. Now, at the time, there were not only plans for an Amazing Spider-Man 3, but there were plans for a wider Sony cinematic universe. But because of the poor ratings and the less than stellar box office results, there was a lack of confidence in the future of the series. So Sony had begun shifting focus to putting Peter Parker into the MCU. Eventually, Amy Pascal reached an agreement with Kevin Feige, and in February of 2015, it was announced that Spider-Man would be entering the MCU. But how specifically was not clear. It was said that Peter Parker would be getting his own Spider-Man movie in the MCU, but first he would appear in a different MCU movie. Avi Arad and Matt Tolmach, producers for the Amazing Spider-Man series, were set to serve as executive producers, while neither director Marc Webb nor actor Andrew Garfield would return for the new film. So once all the contracts and rights were ironed out, the search began for the next Peter Parker. It was said by Kevin Feige that he wanted the character to be 15 to 16 years old,
so much younger than the previous iterations of the character. Nat Wolff, Asa Butterfield, Timothy Chalamet, Liam James, Joseph Quinn, Chandler Riggs, Judah Lewis, Matt Lintz, Charlie Plummer, and Charlie Rowe were all considered for the role. In early 2015, a handful of these young actors were brought on to do screen tests with both Chris Evans and Robert Downey Jr. Eventually, on June 23, 2015, it was announced that actor Tom Holland had gotten the role. The director search was not as vast, but a handful of directors were considered. Drew Goddard, who was allegedly going to direct the Sinister Six film that never happened, was a leading candidate for a time, but he eventually dropped out. Jonathan Levine, Ted Melfi, Jason Moore, John Francis Daly, and Jonathan Goldstein were all considered, but eventually it was John Watts who was given the director's chair, and he was announced as lead director the same day Tom Holland was announced as Spider-Man. In March of the following year, Zendaya was cast as Michelle. Eventually we would learn in this movie that Michelle was short for Michelle Jones, aka MJ. A month later, Michael Keaton was announced to be playing the Vulture. One of the more interesting choices made with this film was actually the omission of a lot of classic Spider-Man characters. Obviously, Peter and May would be in the movie, and then Flash Thompson also made the cut. But that's it. Every other Spider-Man character you know did not make it into the final movie. Not even Uncle Ben would be in the movie. Yes, Michelle Jones eventually became MJ, but even then, Mary Jane Watson was not going to be in the movie. It was also announced that this first Spider-Man movie would not be an origin story. Instead, it would pick up with Peter Parker shortly after meeting Tony Stark and a bunch of Avengers. Principal photography ran from June 2016 to October of 2016. In the following year, on July 7th, 2017, Spider-Man Homecoming would release in theaters. Now, the obvious and major difference between this film and the previous 5 films is the film's placement in the MCU. This was not simply movie 1 of a new Spider-Man trilogy. It was movie 16 of the MCU, and the second movie featuring Tom Holland's Peter Parker. Spider-Man has always been a more grounded character. He's only ever helping around New York, and he spends most of his time fighting the smaller criminals. Considering the MCU exists in this universe, and that Peter Parker is friends with Tony Stark, this movie had a tough job at balancing Peter with the wider MCU. How can you tell a story about a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man when he's involved with the Avengers? Now, despite this, the movie is still pretty small in scale. I would actually argue it's smaller in scale than the previous 5 Spider-Man movies. I actually think this works in the movie's favor. I mean, what have I been repeating throughout each of my previous 2 Spider-Man videos? Spider-Man movies are at their best when they're Peter Parker films, not Spider-Man films. And Spider-Man Homecoming is a Peter Parker film. And even though there are a ton of MCU references, and even though Tony Stark is in the movie, none of this takes the spotlight away from Peter Parker. In fact, I would go as far as saying this movie does a great job at balancing Peter's place in the MCU. In the previous Spider-Man movies, Peter needs to figure out what kind of hero he's going to be, because he is the only superhero out there. With this movie, there's a whole roster of Avengers. Peter is not the only superhero. He has plenty of people to look up to. And this is the focus of the story. How would Spider-Man react to being in a world where he is not the only superhero? What arc could he possibly go down? Well, what if you have Peter Parker being so obsessed with becoming an Avenger, he forgets why he became Spider-Man in the first place? This is the crux of Peter's story in this movie. He needs to learn that there is more to being a superhero than just being an Avenger. He knows what he wants Spider-Man to be, but he needs to figure out what he wants Peter Parker to be. So let's dive into it. Peter's story begins with a brief recap of his story in Captain America: Civil War. He's basically treating this like the best field trip he's ever had. He has all these new gadgets, he's taking private jets, and he gets to interact with some of the most famous people in the world. Peter is having the time of his life. So after the recap, Tony drops him off back in Queens, and Peter couldn't be more excited for his next mission. Except that next mission never really comes. Happy and Tony tell Peter to just lay low and fight local crime. But how could he become an Avenger if all he's doing is stopping local bank robberies? This line of thinking just goes to show how immature Peter Parker is to begin this movie. I love this about his character. This Peter is way more of a kid compared to the previous two. Yes, a big part of that is the role Peter's school and his classmates play in this movie. He has a best friend, he has a crush, he's involved with school clubs, all of that is present. But the biggest part is just how immature he is. So the first important thing Spider-Man does in this movie is stop a bank robbery. While he does stop the criminals, because he is unfamiliar with the alien weapons, he causes a ton of collateral damage, including the destruction of a local bodega across the street. How does Peter react? Well, he quickly checks on the owner and moves on with his life. Did Peter Parker take responsibility for his actions? No, he really didn't. He stopped the bad guys, and at this point, that's all that matters to him. Later on, Peter is at a party, but he gets sidetracked by an explosion. He goes to investigate and only gets himself in further trouble. He gets attacked by the Vulture and needs to be saved by Tony. Now, people have used this idea of Peter being Iron Man Jr. as a criticism towards these movies. Typically, Peter is always struggling. He needs to learn lessons the hard way, and he's not supposed to have a safety net. Does that mean this story is fundamentally not Spider-Man? Does that mean this story betrays what Spider-Man is supposed to represent? Yes and no. If this was the first Spider-Man movie in a new universe, then yeah, I would think this is a problem. But this is not just a Spider-Man movie. It's a part of a wider MCU, and Peter is not the focus of this MCU. In the grand scheme of things, he's a side character. By the time we reach the end of No Way Home, it's clear that the plan for this trilogy was to have Peter go on a journey where he ends up being the Spider-Man we all know and love. One who is down in the dumps, has sacrificed everything, has awful luck, and truly understands his role as Spider-Man. So given this is the direction of his story, and given that Peter is not the face of this MCU, I don't mind this story at all. On this channel, I've spoken many times about stories where legacy characters go on arcs where they eventually become the version of the character that everyone knows and loves. I typically don't think this type of story structure works that well, because that usually means to begin a story, you're presenting a version of the character that many people aren't familiar with, and they tend to get frustrated by that. But in all those instances, the legacy character was the focus of those entire stories. Again, with the MCU, Peter is not the focus of the MCU. He is not the main character. And because the MCU is so much different than the previous Spider-Man universes we've gotten, I'm okay with the writers taking this character down that different path. Moving back to Peter's story, Tony tells Peter to lay low, but Peter doesn't listen. From his point of view, Tony doesn't understand that he could help. Tony doesn't understand that he is worthy of being an Avenger. So Peter continues to investigate these alien weapons and the people who are dealing them. While this happens, the movie provides us with more and more evidence of how irresponsible Peter is. Peter is ignoring his studies because at this point he is so much bigger than just being a high schooler, right? He hacks into his suit and removes the training wheels protocol because he doesn't need to be held back. He knows what he's doing. Now, because of his recklessness, Ned brings the alien stone into the Washington Monument, and a crisis happens. A mess that almost gets his classmates and his best friend killed. But thankfully, Peter is there to save the day, to clean up a mess he created. Did Peter take responsibility for his actions? No, for the second time, he didn't. This leads Peter to the ferry, where he once again wants to stop the bad guys. Tony calls him to presumably tell him about the FBI's plan to stop the weapons dealers, but Peter has such extreme tunnel vision that he hangs up on Tony, because all that matters to him right now is stopping the bad guys, so he can be an Avenger. Of course, things go terribly. Peter is responsible for destroying the boat, and once again, he needs to be saved by Iron Man. By the way, people criticize this movie for having Tony repeatedly save Peter. I think that's a little ridiculous. He only saves him twice. So you guys need to chill. Anyway, afterwards, Peter gets chastised by Tony, and Tony asks for the suit back. Iconically, Peter says, "I am nothing without this suit," and Tony says, "If you're nothing without this suit, then you shouldn't have it." This is the low point of the story. To Peter, that spider suit represents being an Avenger. So if Tony takes that suit away from Peter, then Peter no longer sees any worth in himself. Peter needs to learn that there's more to the suit than just being an Avenger, what it really means to be a superhero, and that's what Peter has to learn without the suit. So Peter is ready to go to homecoming with his crush Liz. When he gets there, he learns that Michael Keaton, the Vulture, is Liz's dad. Now this is the first big story beat in the movie that I didn't love. Sure, it's a clever twist, but it's too much of a convenience. Peter is able to go on this character arc because out of the blue, her crush's dad happens to be the main bad guy. It's just too convenient and too easy for Peter. Now this is not the end of the world, because despite me not loving this story beat, I think the writers do a pretty great job with it. Shortly afterwards, we get the famous car scene, and this scene still absolutely slaps. The visual language of the Vulture figuring out that Peter is Spider-Man is genius. But what it also does is show what kind of person Peter is. Sure, he's at a low point right now, but he's starting to remember why he became Spider-Man in the first place. It's no longer about being an Avenger. It's no longer about impressing Tony Stark. It's about doing what's right, and that's what Peter wants to do now. Peter bails on the homecoming and goes after the Vulture. This leads to another great scene where the two confront each other yet again. The Vulture monologues for a bit, but it's just to stall Peter so he can get trapped under the warehouse. There's no Tony to save him, no super suit to save him. So if Peter's gonna want to escape, he's gonna have to do it himself. What kind of man is he going to be? What kind of Spider-Man is he going to be? Peter pushes through, escapes, and goes after the Vulture once again, which leads us to the final fight of the movie. To be honest, I find this final fight on the plane and then on the beach to be the weakest part of the movie, because even though Peter has learned his lesson internally, the events that transpire don't reinforce that. What had Peter been doing all movie? Recklessly chasing after the bad guys, and as a result, there was a ton of collateral damage. What happens here? Peter pretty recklessly chases the Vulture through the skies. Peter is now all alone without help on the outside of a plane. Then he and Vulture fight, which results in a plane crash on a beach. The only reason Peter doesn't get chastised at the end of the movie is solely because the plane crashes on the beach and not in a populated civilian area. Think about it. If the plane just crashes 100 yards inward, then like thousands of people died. And once again, Peter recklessly chased the villains, and there were serious consequences to that. But because he just crashes on the beach, no one gets hurt, and Peter's a hero. I think the fight itself is pretty cool, and I like that Peter still decides to save the Vulture in the end, but to me this is no different than what he has been doing all movie. But regardless, Peter saves the day, Tony thanks him, and welcomes him into the Avengers. This was the thing Peter had wanted all movie, but he has now learned the value of being that friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, so he says no to Tony. Now the reason he is able to learn this lesson is not just because of his trials and tribulations, but also because of the Vulture, the villain. So let's talk about him. Adrian Toomes, aka the Vulture, is a pretty good villain. I wouldn't put him in the class of great comic book villains, but he was a pretty good one. The reason why is because his presence in the story reinforces Peter's arc. So Toomes originally was just a contractor who was contracted to help clean up the Battle of New York. He is fired so Tony's damage control division can clean up instead. The lesson that Adrian Toomes learns is that everyone like him, every normal person, needs to fight for their fair share. Little guys like he and Peter will be stomped on by the big guys if they do nothing about it. This is why he steals all the alien weapons, and this is why he sells them. Why should all the big corporations and the billionaires get to keep the weapons while the normal people starve? By the time we get to the warehouse scene where he traps Peter, we learn why thematically his story is so relevant. Peter in this movie needs to learn that not everything is about being an Avenger, that it's more important that he helps where he is needed, to be responsible, and at this point be that friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. Adrian Toomes and his band of criminals are able to run rampant because there is no friendly neighborhood superhero. These guys aren't an Avengers level threat. I'd even argue they aren't a city level threat. But what they're doing is still wrong, and just because they're not an Avengers level threat, that doesn't mean they shouldn't be dealt with. Fighting Toomes reinforces Peter's newfound belief that there is value in fighting smaller threats, because Toomes is a smaller threat. This is the type of writing that I love. Adrian Toomes is not the most complex villain in the world. He is not some super evil dude, and he doesn't have some super evil elaborate plot. He is just a bad guy whose main focus is to reinforce the themes of the movie and the character arc of our main character. And I'd prefer that over most other kinds of villains in these movies. Spider-Man Homecoming may not be the perfect start to a Spider-Man trilogy, but it is a pretty good start to a Spider-Man trilogy in the MCU, and clearly this film has aged pretty well. Spider-Man: Homecoming scored a 92% on Rotten Tomatoes, along with an 87% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored a 7.4 out of 10. Homecoming would end up grossing $880 million at the box office, making it just a tad shy of being the highest-grossing Spider-Man movie ever, falling just behind Spider-Man 3, but this also made Homecoming the 6th highest-grossing movie of 2017. With the success of Homecoming, the sequel would be put into production nearly instantly, especially since Tom Holland was already signed on for 2 more movies. Now, the most interesting thing about the production of this movie actually has very little to do with this movie itself, but more to do with the 2 Avengers movies that came out right before it. As we likely all know, Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame were released between Homecoming and Far From Home. Sony was persistent in holding its 2-year window between movies, which would mean that Far From Home would release just 2 months after Avengers Endgame. Now, the reason this complicates things is because marketing for a movie has to begin much longer than 2 months before the release. As all of you know, Spider-Man died in Infinity War, which meant the first trailers for Far From Home released before he was revived in Endgame, despite the movie taking place after Endgame. I remember watching this trailer before Endgame came out, and I thought it was so funny that Marvel knew everyone knew Peter would come back, so they might as well just release the trailer anyway. And this proved to not be the biggest deal in the world. Principal photography began in July of 2018 and concluded in October of 2018. In the following summer, on July 2nd, 2019, Spider-Man: Far From Home would release in theaters. Spider-Man: Far From Home is one of the more conflicting Spider-Man movies for me. You know, usually people will say that a movie has a pretty shitty foundation, but it's packaged nicely. You know how they say if you put icing on shit, it's still shit? My opinion on this movie is the complete opposite. I like the foundation of this movie and the main arc that Peter goes on, but what I really don't like is everything that surrounds that core story. So I want to focus on my dislikes first. My biggest criticism of this movie, and funny enough, it really doesn't have anything to do with Spider-Man, is the treatment of the post-Endgame world. This movie was not only the first MCU movie after Endgame, but it was also just released like 2 months after Endgame. The potential stories you could tell exploring how the world would react to having half of its population disappear and then pop back up 5 years later is fascinating to me. However, the movie wants to explore none of that. Unless it's about Tony Stark's death, this movie is uninterested in any other consequence from Avengers Endgame, and I really don't like that. I get that this is supposed to be a Spider-Man movie first and an MCU movie second, but I love Infinity War and Endgame, so it's pretty disappointing that the writers chose to ignore so much of that. All of your favorite heroes that died in the previous movie, their deaths are treated as jokes in the first scene of this movie. Now, the more egregious thing that this movie does is just have every single important character blip alongside Peter. Literally, every single important character from Homecoming blipped. And how do any of them feel about this? It's not a big deal, just a minor inconvenience, and we can joke about it. Peter and May both disappeared. You would think that maybe something would have happened to their apartment while they were gone, but no, the movie is uninterested in exploring that. Now, I get why the writers chose to go down this path. If you want Peter to struggle between being a kid and being Spider-Man, then you need to make being a kid as attractive as possible. So if everyone is depressed in his personal life, then Peter being Peter Parker isn't as attractive. So while I get it, I don't love it. And also, as a result of this movie being so lighthearted, there's a lot of humor, and I really don't vibe with a lot of the humor in this movie. Like Ned's relationship with Betty. This solely exists for laughs, and it doesn't always work. Granted, there are some funny moments in the movie. I don't know why. When Peter slaps Flash and knocks him out, that made me audibly laugh, but for the most part, I don't vibe with the humor of this movie. Now, this next criticism I want to levy towards this movie kind of applies to the entire trilogy, and that's the treatment of the supporting characters. May, MJ, and Ned are all entertaining characters with charismatic actors, but when you think about it, their characters are pretty shallow, especially with their dynamic with Peter. Remember how Homecoming ended with May finding out Peter was Spider-Man? Well, that's never addressed in a meaningful way. This movie begins and she's doing events with Spider-Man and is happy to be doing it. I believe in No Way Home there was a throwaway line about May freaking out when she found out, but that's all we get. That is a missed opportunity. Ned and MJ both never have anything interesting going on either. Unless it's directly related to their relationship with Peter, there is nothing else going on in their lives. No Way Home is a bit better about this, but anything that could be interesting is ignored because the writers don't want them to fight with Peter. Now, speaking of MJ, the fact that Tom Holland and Zendaya have such great chemistry together hides the fact that this relationship is so forced. MJ barely has any scenes in Homecoming, let alone meaningful scenes with Peter. Not once in that movie does Peter look at MJ in a romantic way. To begin this movie, the literal first scene with Peter is him forming a plan to ask out MJ. It comes out of nowhere. Now, the writers were actually kind of smart here. Remember, they ended the previous movie with the reveal that Michelle was actually Michelle Jones, aka MJ. Because we know MJ is Spider-Man's love interest, this is what we expect to happen in the second movie. It's kind of like Harry and Peter's relationship in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. We buy their friendship only because of the Spider-Man lore that Harry and Peter are friends, not anything the writers accomplished. The same thing happens here. We accept MJ and Peter's relationship because that's the Spider-Man lore, not anything the writers did to build this relationship. Unfortunately, I'm a nerd and a loser who talks about movies on YouTube for a living, so I notice these things and I don't like them. This next point I'm going to bring up is going to sound so nitpicky, but while rewatching this movie, I could not stop thinking about it. I like the concept of Mysterio's powers. The illusion tech makes Mysterio a very unique villain, and it allows the story to challenge Peter in the right way. With that being said, the execution and logistics of these drones makes no sense to me. So this is the extent of my understanding. These projectors are essentially the best projectors in the world, and they're attached to drones that can shoot and blow up stuff. However, there is overwhelming evidence throughout the movie that the drones can allegedly do more than this. When they're in Italy, Peter gets punched by the water monster and gets wet. Are these drones shooting water at Peter? Later on, when they're fighting the fire monster, who is literally summoning lava out of the ground, do any of these characters feel an ounce of heat from this monster? You'd think that being right next to a fire monster would be really hot, but that's something that characters never consider or acknowledge. When they're fighting on the bridge in the end, I believe people are clearly affected by the strong winds surrounding the bridge. I don't believe these drones have the ability to summon wind. Now, the biggest one that caught my eye is that more than once, Nick Fury and Maria Hill say they detect seismic activity whenever the monster is about to attack. How can there be seismic activity if these monsters are just illusions? It makes no sense. So the ability of these drones depends on what the plot demands from them, and I find that to be really frustrating. Now, the last negative I want to bring up, and this will actually tie in pretty perfectly into my discussion about Peter and his character arc, is that this movie is not really a sequel to Homecoming. I get that 2 Avengers movies happened between Homecoming and Far From Home, but even then, this movie is not a thematic sequel to Homecoming. What did I argue Homecoming was about? Peter learning the value of being a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, to know where he is needed. The 2 Avengers movies then feature Peter going to space and fighting aliens, and then this movie is about Peter traveling the world and having to learn that he has a larger responsibility to the world now that he's Spider-Man. I can't say I prefer one message over the other, but it is fair to point out that these 2 are in conflict with each other, and I don't feel the writers organically got us from one point to another. So those are my dislikes of Far From Home. But at the end of the day, it's the main character and his journey and his story that matters the most, and I actually quite like that about this film. So let's talk about it. Peter's arc in this movie is very much textbook Spider-Man. Peter is struggling to balance the lives of Peter Parker and Spider-Man. So Peter goes on this trip and he clearly just wants to spend time with his friends. He has a crush on a girl, he's going to some very romantic places in Europe, so he wants to ask her out. Repeatedly throughout the first half of the movie, he's also being told, don't forget you're Spider-Man, you have this duty. May tells him this, Mysterio tells him this, and Nick Fury most notably tells him this. Spider-Man is actively interfering with Peter Parker's life. Now, this movie doesn't go as far as the original Spider-Man 2 did. It's not like Spider-Man here is actively ruining Peter's life. It's more so like a big inconvenience than anything. Also, Peter doesn't want to give up being Spider-Man, he just wants to take a nice break. Now, a big part of his struggle is of course that he just wants to be a teenager on a break, but also the movie goes to show the other big part of it are Peter's insecurities in himself. Peter feels like there's this expectation that he has to be the next Iron Man. The crowd in the beginning asks him that, Nick Fury makes him feel like that, and Tony literally chooses Peter to be in charge of Edith. Yes, Peter is grieving Tony, but because the entire world has put Tony on this pedestal, Peter feels like he can't come close to living up to it. So that is another major reason why Peter wants to avoid being Spider-Man right now. Eventually, he meets Mysterio, someone who Peter feels like is worthy of being the next Iron Man. So he gives Mysterio the glasses, fully acknowledging he can't be the next Iron Man, but Beck can. Shortly afterwards, he realizes he made a massive mistake, tries to fix it, but is thoroughly outclassed by Mysterio. This is the low point of the movie. Peter goes back to Happy, admitting he feels lost. He feels unworthy and that he's not ready to be the next Iron Man. However, Happy tells Peter that Tony never wavered in his belief in Peter, and that he wouldn't want Peter to be the next Iron Man, but to be Spider-Man. What I really like about the end of the movie is that Peter can only defeat Beck in a way that only he can. Peter needs to use his quote-unquote Peter tingle to see through the drones and find where Beck really is. That final moment where Peter prevents Beck from shooting him is something that Iron Man couldn't do, only Spider-Man could. So Peter is able to survive and win the day because he finally embraced being Spider-Man. I love this arc, I really do. It's a great lesson for Peter, and it's a great lesson to center a Spider-Man movie around. Now, at some points, I do think the movie undermines its own message. People have pointed this out, but right after Happy tells Peter he doesn't have to be Iron Man, Happy starts playing the music from the first Iron Man movie, and Peter builds his suit like Tony would build his suit. That's just a contradicting visual. But overall, I really love this arc. Also, one thing this trilogy does really well is retroactively make previous decisions better. Focusing so much on Tony in Homecoming in isolation is not great, but by focusing on that so much, it's more relatable that in this movie Peter would struggle with Tony's shadow. So Far From Home retroactively justified Homecoming's decisions. I like that. Now when it comes to Beck, I think he's a fine villain. His motivations are a bit shallow, but I do like how he mirrors Peter. Peter is someone so terrified and so insecure of continuing Tony's legacy, but he proves to be right for the job. Beck is someone who so desperately wants to continue Tony's legacy, yet he's an awful person and he's terrible for the job. So I like that Peter and Beck mirror each other in that respect. But overall, despite me quite loving Peter's story, there's too much about this movie that I don't like that holds it back from me calling it good. I wouldn't say it's bad, but it's certainly far from great. Spider-Man Far From Home scored a 91% on Rotten Tomatoes along with a 95% audience score. Pretty high if you ask me. On IMDb, the movie scored a 7.3 out of 10. Far From Home grossed $1.13 billion at the box office, making it the first billion-dollar Spider-Man movie and the highest-grossing Spider-Man movie at the time. It also became the fourth highest-grossing movie of 2019. Now, unlike the production of the previous movie, the production of this movie was heading towards disaster. Marvel and Sony held negotiations to renew their Spider-Man deal. The specifics of what company owed what percentage over what thing doesn't really matter. What all that really does matter is that Marvel and Sony couldn't come to an agreement, and for a time, Spider-Man was no longer going to be a part of the MCU. In September of 2019, Sony chairman Tony Vinciquerra said that for the moment the door is closed on Spider-Man returning to the MCU. Fans were devastated, and they continued to protest every chance they could. Eventually, after even Tom Holland spoke up, Sony and Marvel met again to try to agree on terms. Thankfully, both studios were able to come to an agreement, and Peter Parker / Tom Holland would be staying into the MCU, and the third and final film in the trilogy would be put into production. John Watts and of course Tom Holland would return, and principal photography was supposed to begin early on in 2020, but of course COVID hit, so this delayed production and the release of the movie. Principal photography ran from October of 2020 to March of 2021. Now, if you remember, once all the previous villains from the previous movies were announced to be returning, it was the worst kept secret in Hollywood that Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield would also be returning. The marketing tried to keep this a secret, but everyone knew the truth. On December 17th, 2021, Spider-Man No Way Home released in theaters. Going into my rewatch of No Way Home, I was so excited because I had not seen this movie since the opening day it was released. I loved the movie when it first came out, but since then a lot of people have been talking pretty negatively about this movie. I've seen people say that once the nostalgia wears off, the movie's no longer that good. They point out moments where the movie wants the audience to clap, but watching it at home on a TV it's awkward. I've seen videos show up on my feed saying this movie gets worse upon every rewatch. So after 5 years, I have finally rewatched this movie, and I can confidently say that I love this movie just as much as I did when I first saw it 5 years ago. This movie is excellent. It's an excellent superhero movie, and more importantly, it's an excellent Spider-Man movie. Also, keep in mind, I'm not the biggest Spider-Man fan in the world, so it's not like I'm overwhelmed with nostalgia while watching this movie. I genuinely think it's a great movie. Now, it's not a perfect movie. Visually, this movie and frankly, the entire trilogy is uninteresting. These movies lack the sauce. Besides the shots of Peter staring at the billboard in the rain, I can't remember a single other shot that was visually beautiful. Also, a lot of the CGI is pretty bad. It's usually these background shots that just look awful, but the story of this movie I love wholeheartedly. So let's talk about it. Everything about this movie builds up to the ending. The writers know that Peter's sacrifice is the climax of this entire trilogy. It needs to hit as hard as possible. So right away from the beginning, the writers do the legwork to make sure that the ending hits hard. Peter's identity is revealed to the world, everyone now knows who he is, but more importantly, everyone knows who's in Peter's inner circle: May, Happy, Ned, and MJ. The first 30 minutes of this movie is entirely devoted to showing how Peter being doxxed is ruining his life. His school life is ruined, he had to move into a new apartment, Spider-Man's reputation is ruined, he keeps having run-ins with the cops. Peter's life is going pretty terribly right now. Now, frankly, I don't entirely buy that everyone would hate Spider-Man. This movie in the chronology is still not that far removed from the events of Endgame. Spider-Man is an Avenger who helped save the world. I'm surprised so many people hate him. Also, the whole Mysterio thing is nonsense. It would be so easy to expose Mysterio for the fraud that he was, but Peter never does it. Besides that, no issues here. I love seeing Peter's life ruined. Now, even though it takes a while for the first action scene to happen, the simple concept of Spider-Man's identity being revealed is so interesting enough that it's able to drive the movie for these first 30 minutes. The movie's able to move forward and take its time because it's presenting such an interesting concept. I also like that the writers use this time to develop Peter's relationship to MJ and Ned more. If he's going to sacrifice that relationship in the end, the movie really needs to highlight how important these two are to him. So Peter talks about how important it is that they all go to Boston together, and we get a lot of smaller moments between Peter and MJ of them just bonding as a couple. These scenes alone do far more for their relationship than the entirety of the previous two movies. Now, the turning point of this first act is with the admission letters. Peter, Ned, and MJ all get rejected from MIT, but most importantly, they all got rejected because of Spider-Man. Peter is negatively impacting his friends' lives, and this is something that he will not stand for. So he goes to Doctor Strange, who says he will help Peter make everyone forget Peter Parker is Spider-Man. Frankly, I'm quite surprised Strange would do this so casually, but whatever, the wish goes wrong, and here come the villains from the previous movies. Now, I gotta address the elephant in the room. Is this movie simply Spider-Man fan service the movie? Yeah, there is a lot of fan service, but I don't care how much fan service we get. If it all serves the main character and the story and the themes, then I will embrace it with open arms. Other than the stupid, I'm somewhat of a scientist myself line, and I guess the pointing scene, everything serves the story in a meaningful way, including the return of Tobey and Andrew. If you look at this movie as the culmination of 8 Spider-Man movies rather than just the 3 Tom Holland ones, this movie works a lot better. There are a plethora of moments between the villains and the other Peters that build off the previous movies so nicely. How Otto would react to seeing Norman alive, or the fact that Otto and Norman would know each other. That makes sense. They're both scientists. Or Dr. Connors and Max Dillon knowing each other. They both worked at Oscorp. That makes sense. I really like these moments. Also, the scene where Tobey was with Otto was so sweet, and the scene with Max and Andrew was also great. Both Andrew and Tobey using their trauma to motivate Tom's Peter, those were powerful scenes. Or especially Andrew's Peter catching MJ, redeeming what he couldn't do with Gwen. These moments aren't just fan service. They build upon the previous movies, even the bad ones. Now, I will say there are a few inconsistencies with the villains and who they were in their previous movies, but it's not too jarring. Anyway, I have no problems with the fan service in this movie. For the first time, an MCU Spider-Man movie is more of a Spider-Man movie and not an MCU movie. And I love that. So you're not going to hear me complain about that, because other than a few silly moments and a few silly jokes, all the villains and the return of the two other Peters, it all serves this Peter's story. Now moving back to where I last left off, Peter is tasked with finding all the previous villains and returning them to Doctor Strange. Now this is where the theme and the internal conflict of the movie kicks in. The previous movie ended with Peter embracing who he is as Spider-Man. This movie says, okay, Spider-Man is someone who will always sacrifice for what's right, so what are you willing to sacrifice? And this is what Peter struggles with. This entire movie is basically scene after scene of Peter knowingly making his life worse because he knows it's the right thing to do. Yeah, Peter made a pretty big mistake with Doctor Strange in the beginning of the movie, but multiple times Peter has had an out. After he captures all the villains, he has an out right there. Doctor Strange can press the button and send these villains home. But to Peter, he feels the right thing to do is help these villains gain a second chance. So he fights Doctor Strange and steals the cube. Later on in the movie, the Green Goblin ruins everything. All the villains get away, and most importantly, Norman kills Aunt May. Peter has an out yet again. He can press the button and send these villains home, but he still doesn't do it. Later on, even after he's saved 4 out of the 5 villains, he yet again can send everyone home, but he still doesn't do it. Each time he passes on the opportunity to send everyone home, things get worse for him. The first time, May dies. The second time, all his friends are put in danger and everyone is after him. And of course, the third time, things get even worse where he has to make the ultimate sacrifice for everyone to forget him. Also, I love that Peter struggles with this decision each time. Just because Spider-Man is someone who will always sacrifice for the greater good, that doesn't mean he won't ever struggle with it. Even up to the very end when he wants to kill Norman, he is still struggling with this. At this point in my Spider-Man video series, I've talked about 8 different Spider-Man movies, and how many times has he struggled with this? In nearly every one. But that's what Spider-Man does. That's what a Spider-Man movie should be about. Now, one thing I specifically want to highlight about this movie is Aunt May. May wasn't a big standout for me in the previous 2 movies. She was more of a hot aunt than anything, but I loved what they did with her in this movie. Finally, she gets to be that emotional anchor that Peter needs. It's her words that motivate Peter throughout the movie. And when she dies, having that be the moment where she drops the great power line was genius to me. It felt earned, it came from the right person, and it's what Peter needed to hear at that moment. I thought it was brilliantly done. Now this leads me to the end of the movie. In order to save the day, Peter must make everyone forget who he is, including his best friend and his girlfriend. The ending is so brilliant in so many different ways. As I've stated, the movie did the legwork to earn this ending. We know how big of a sacrifice this is for Peter. So what is Peter willing to sacrifice? Literally everything. Now, remember how in my section on Far From Home, I mentioned that these movies do a good job at justifying previous decisions? Well, Peter being Iron Boy Jr. and having everything handed to him retroactively works because of this ending. It's one thing to have someone start at a point of nothing. It's another thing to give someone everything and then take it away from them until they have nothing. Peter at the end of this movie is arguably at a lower point than any other Spider-Man has been at any other point. If you wanted to argue Andrew Spider-Man was at a worse point because his girlfriend literally died, I'd hear you out, but to me, Tom Spider-Man has lost everything besides Spider-Man. Yeah, MJ is still alive, but she's not his girlfriend anymore. So Peter has nothing, he's at his lowest point, and I love the final shots where we finally see Peter live in this rundown apartment where he has nothing. This ending made the previous 7 Spider-Man movies, and more specifically the previous 2 Tom Holland movies, significantly better, and those are 2 movies that I don't love. I love Spider-Man No Way Home. I love its ending, I love its story, I love its themes, and I will always defend it as a great superhero movie. Spider-Man No Way Home scored a 93% on Rotten Tomatoes, along with a 97% audience score. On IMDb, the movie scored an 8.1 out of 10. No Way Home would end up grossing $1.91 billion at the box office, making it by far the highest grossing Spider-Man movie, and also the highest grossing movie of 2021 by an even wider margin. With the home trilogy now complete, the immediate future for Spider-Man was uncertain. But as we all know, Tom Holland would not be done playing Peter Parker. 5 years later, the 4th Tom Holland Spider-Man movie would be released in theaters. Spoilers for Brand New Day. I loved this movie. Wow, I love this movie. There are a ton of reasons why this movie is an excellent addition into the Spider-Man mythos, but maybe the biggest one is what it does for Tom Holland's Peter Parker. A lot of people have been talking about how this movie is the first true grounded Spider-Man movie we have gotten with Tom Holland, and I agree. Spider-Man just works so great when he is New York's hero and he goes out of his way to fight the smaller criminals of New York. I love that Spider-Man is no longer just one of the Avengers. He is New York's superhero, and the movie does a great job at establishing that. I love the little montage we got in the beginning of all the little villains he had fought in New York over the past 4 years. Spider-Man belongs to New York. The ending scene where Peter sees all the love for Spider-Man was so perfect, although it makes you question why the public would hate Spider-Man so much in the beginning of the previous movie. Anyway, for the first time in his tenure as Spider-Man, his movies have the sauce. I've said this before, each of the 3 home movies were so bland except for like 1 or 2 scenes where John Watts decided to lock in. This movie is shot so much better than the previous movies. Also, the action is much better. I wouldn't know this because I have never played the games, but people have pointed out that this movie takes inspiration from a lot of the Spider-Man video games, like some of his specific moves come straight from those games. I love that. Even though I didn't notice it, that's a great way to pay homage to a popular video game while also making the movie better. Spider-Man's physicality in this movie feels so much more real than it did before. Another aspect of this movie that really worked well overall would be the roles of the supporting characters. For a movie that has as many supporting characters in it as this one, you would think that the movie could become really cluttered and unfocused, kind of like Spider-Man 3 or The Amazing Spider-Man 2. But I feel like the reason Brand New Day is able to accomplish pulling this off is because of 2 reasons. One is that this movie still takes advantage of the universe that it's in. We've already had character development for every important character in this movie besides Jean Grey. Yelena, Frank, Bruce, MJ, these are characters we already know and love, so we don't need to take time away from Peter to develop them. Also, these characters solely exist to support Peter's story. These characters are thematically relevant, yes, but they're not going on their own stories with their own arcs. They exist to progress Peter's story, so it doesn't feel crowded at all. Someone might complain about Yelena's cameo saying it's stupid fan service. I disagree. It makes sense that someone from the New Avengers would be familiar with Spider-Man. Also, Yelena's scene in the hot tub makes an otherwise boring exposition scene memorable and entertaining. Bruce is maybe the least relevant of all the important characters, but it makes sense why Peter would go to him. Also, when they were fighting the Hulk, I couldn't help but smile once I realized we were getting a fight scene between the Hulk, the Punisher, and Spider-Man. That was so surreal to me. Now, speaking of Frank Castle, his inclusion in this movie was genius. His dynamic with Peter in this movie is so great and so entertaining. Every time the two are together on screen, it made for some awesome and hilarious moments. These two are such perfect foils, and I love that this movie didn't waste time having them meet for the first time. They already know each other, and it makes sense. Now, more importantly, Frank is thematically relevant to the story. As I'll get into, this movie is about loneliness and how that can be destructive to someone. Very few people would know this better than Frank Castle, so we can give Peter a valuable perspective. Now, speaking of this theme, the main reason I love this movie is Peter's story and the arc he goes on. I love that this movie's main focus is to take away any glorification of Peter's sacrifice. Yes, what Peter did was noble and selfless, but specifically for young men, this can be glorified, especially when you look at someone like Frank Castle, who is a badass, but deep down is really all alone and struggling. This movie shows that things couldn't be better for Spider-Man, but Peter Parker is really struggling. Peter can keep telling himself that protecting MJ and Ned and everyone else is what's most important, but that doesn't change the fact that Peter is a human being and human beings are social creatures. Giving Peter this arc also allowed for Ned and MJ to have a role in this movie without it feeling forced. Yeah, it would make sense that to threaten Spider-Man, the main villain would go after the girl he loves. The scene where MJ reads the letter was such a powerful scene. Peter might have been protecting MJ with his sacrifice, but Peter did also take away agency from MJ. He made the choice to not be together for her, and I can totally understand how that would make MJ feel. This movie did such a good job at building off the ending of No Way Home. It doesn't undermine it by any means, and it allows there to be a handful of powerful scenes for Peter. Now, the main struggle that Peter has is that he is mutating into a more powerful Spider-Man, but he is having trouble managing it because of his internal struggle. By the end of the movie, he accepts that it is important that he has people in his life that he loves, and that allows him to embrace these new powers and help Jean in the end. And speaking of Jean, I thought her story beautifully mirrored Peter's, and how women can go through this same thing. This is the most important part of any Spider-Man movie. What is Peter's struggle and how does it relate to his role as Spider-Man? This movie nails that, and that is the main reason why I love this movie. Now, I don't love everything about this movie. More and more, these Tom Holland Spider-Man movies have been diving deeper into the pseudoscience that I really hate. In the last movie, over the span of a single night, Peter can create devices to cure every villain of their powers, and here, Peter Parker, someone who I assume has no sustainable income, has an entire lab in his apartment, a lab where he can create inhibitor chips that can activate and deactivate specific DNA. What are we doing here? The reason I hate this is not because it's unrealistic, this is a Spider-Man movie after all, it's because I feel like it allows the writers to pull something out of their ass to solve a problem. Peter can't defeat a villain because of her powers? Okay, he will just create a device in his bedroom to deactivate those powers. It's ridiculous. I hate it. Also, I don't love the damage control organization. I'm just never on board with these shadowy organizations, but these things don't derail my love for Peter's arc at all. So Spider-Man Brand New Day is a great movie and a great start to hopefully another Spider-Man trilogy. Now, if I had to rank the 9 live-action Spider-Man movies, this would be my ranking. 9th place would be The Amazing Spider-Man 2, a complete mess of a movie with some bright spots. 8th place would be Spider-Man 3, another mess of a movie but slightly more enjoyable. In 7th place, I'll have Far From Home. I like Peter's arc, but I quite hate the overall premise. 6th place is The Amazing Spider-Man, a fine origin story but not one I love. 5th place is Homecoming, a good but not great start to Spider-Man in the MCU. 4th place, I'll have Spider-Man, an iconic start to this franchise. Now, debating these next two is really hard for me, especially because I just saw Brand New Day and I've only seen it once, but I think I'm gonna put No Way Home at 3 and Brand New Day at 2. I love both movies a lot, but I think I like Brand New Day more because it's a lot more personal to Peter Parker. That means number 1 is Spider-Man 2, the best and a nearly perfect Spider-Man movie. If you're curious, these are how the 9 movies rank based on Rotten Tomatoes scores and IMDb scores. Now, if you're upset that I didn't talk about the 2 Spider-Verse movies, don't worry, I'm actually working on that video right now, so you can either stay tuned or click on the link right here if you're watching this in the future. Thank you everyone so much for watching my series of Spider-Man videos. This was a lot of fun, and I can't wait to do more videos like this. Don't forget to unite the Claude Squad, and I'll see you guys next time.